Hello there, my moonlit travelers. Tonight, we follow the complete story of the Volturi twins, Jane and Alec, the most feared members of the Volturi Guard, and the two beings Aro prizes above everything else he has spent 3,000 years collecting. They began as human children in medieval England, burned alive by the village that feared them, and emerged from the fire as something the entire vampire world would spend centuries learning to dread. Two gifts, two children, one bond that nothing in the world has ever managed to break. If there's a Twilight story you'd love to fall asleep to next, tell me in the comments. I'd love to create it for you. Alright. Now let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Breathe in very slowly, and let the ancient dark of Volterra carry you gently all the way through the night. And there is a particular quality to the English countryside in the early medieval period that no later age quite recovered. It was a landscape still largely uncut, still largely ungoverned in the ways that subsequent centuries would come to mean by that word. The forests were older than any living person's memory could reach. The roads were thin and uncertain, more suggestion than structure, threading between settlements that existed in careful relationship with the wilderness, pressing close against their edges. The sky in the months between autumn and spring was a low and permanent grey, the kind of grey that does not threaten rain so much as simply become the ceiling of the world, sealing the villages beneath it into a particular intimate darkness that the long nights deepened further still. It was a world organized around survival, around the slow and uncertain business of growing enough food and keeping enough warmth and maintaining enough community to make it through another winter. The people who lived in it were not simple, but they were close to the ground in a way that made certain things feel very near. The boundary between the living and the dead was one of those things. The boundary between the natural and the unnatural was another. In a world where the forest could take a person without warning, and the harvest could fail without reason, and children could die of fevers that arrived one evening and were finished by the next, the supernatural was not an abstraction. It was a working explanation for the things that ordinary understanding could not reach. Into this world, I'm in a village in the region that would eventually bear the name Huntingdon. Two children were born. They were twins, which was itself a thing that the world they were born into did not entirely know how to receive. Twin births carried an unease in many early medieval communities, a sense of wrongness about the duplication, as though nature had made an error it could not be trusted to make peacefully again. Some communities absorbed this unease into superstition and left it there. Others let it sharpen into something less comfortable. The specific village of the twins' birth fell somewhere between these positions, which meant the children grew up in an atmosphere of watchfulness that never quite became open hostility in their earliest years, but never quite settled into acceptance either. The girl was born first. She was small and pale, with dark eyes that fixed on faces with an intensity that made adults look away before they had decided to. She was not, in the early years of her childhood, conventionally difficult. She did not cause obvious trouble. She did not misbehave in ways that could be easily named and addressed. What she did was something quieter and harder to respond to. She watched. She noticed things. She understood from very early in her life the precise location of every vulnerability in every person around her. And she held that understanding the way some children hold a sharp thing they have found, not quite knowing what it is for, but knowing instinctively that it has a use. Her brother was different from her in the ways that mattered, and identical to her in the ways that mattered more. Where she was intense, he was still. Where she watched, he observed from such a careful remove that the people around him sometimes forgot, briefly, that he was present at all. He had a quality that was difficult to name in a child, a kind of ambient distance, as though part of him existed slightly outside the immediate reality of any given moment, in a place where things reached him softened and filtered and less urgent than they appeared to everyone else. The village's cold did not seem to touch him the way it touched other children. The village's noise did not seem to reach him at the same volume. He moved through the world as though he had learned very early that the world's ability to affect him was something he could, with sufficient interior distance, manage. Together, they were something the village did not have a precise word for. Not dangerous exactly, not in those early years, but not entirely safe either. Not in the way that children were supposed to be safe. Uncomplicated and readable, and absorbed in the ordinary business of childhood. They were absorbed in each other, which was a different thing entirely. Their bond had the quality of completeness, of two people who had arrived in the world already knowing the only person they needed to know, and who engaged with everyone else from behind that certainty. They played together. They spoke to each other in the particular shorthand of twins who have developed their own interior language. They slept in the same small space and woke at the same time, and moved through the village's communal life with the synchronized ease of two beings who shared a single center of gravity. This completeness was not hostile to the world around them. It was simply indifferent to it, in the specific way that people are indifferent to things they do not need. And indifference, when it comes from children who are already unsettling for other reasons, has a way of reading as contempt in the minds of the people it is directed toward. The gifts, for lack of a better word, made themselves known gradually. With the girl, it was the pain, not caused deliberately, not at first, not with any conscious intention that the child herself could have articulated. It was more that she had a gift for finding the precise word or look or silence that made a person feel something sharp, something that sat in the chest afterward and would not easily dissolve. An adult who crossed her found themselves, in the hours following, with an inexplicable residues of discomfort they could not trace to anything specific she had done. A child who excluded her from a game found themselves, before the afternoon was over, visited by a nameless unhappiness that arrived without reason and left without resolution. She did not know she was doing it, or rather, she knew it in the wordless way that people know things their conscious minds have not yet been given language to hold. She felt something in those moments that was close to satisfaction. And the satisfaction was the closest thing she had in those early years to power. With the boy, it was the absence. Where his sister left a residue, he left a kind of blankness. People who spent time near him found that the immediate urgency of things eased while they were in his proximity. Fears became less sharp. Pains became less insistent. Not gone, not addressed, not resolved, simply quieted. Softened to a level where they could be set down for a moment. Some people found this restful. Most found it, on reflection, deeply unsettling, because the relief his presence offered was not the relief of resolution. It was the relief of removal, of temporary disconnection from one's own experience, and the return of full feeling when he moved away carried with it the particular unease of realizing you had briefly ceased, in some small but real way, to be entirely yourself. The village watched all of this. The village processed it through the frameworks available to it, which in the early medieval period in rural England were frameworks built from scripture and superstition, and the accumulated tradition of a community that had been interpreting unusual things through the same basic vocabulary for generations. What they saw in the twins did not fit neatly into any benign category their vocabulary contained, and things that do not fit into benign categories have a way, in communities organized around the management of collective fear, of eventually finding their way into the other kind. The whispers began before the children were old enough to fully understand what whispers meant. She was seen standing at the edge of the forest at an hour when children were supposed to be inside, looking at something in the dark between the trees that no one else could see. He was seen near the village's sickest elder on a morning when the elder's condition had worsened overnight, and someone, connecting things that perhaps had no connection, mentioned it to someone else in a tone that made the connection feel deliberate. A neighbor's cow gave poor milk for a week, and someone remembered seeing the girl walking past the field the previous morning, and the memory acquired, in the retelling, a significance it had not carried at the time. This is how it always began, in villages like this one, in centuries like this one. Not with a single accusation, but with an accumulation of small observations that were individually dismissible and collectively damning. Each detail was nothing on its own, held together, given the right narrator and the right audience and the right atmosphere of collective anxiety, and they became a shape. And the shape, once people had agreed on it, was very difficult to unsee. The children were aware of the whispers before they were aware of their content. They felt the shift in how the village looked at them. The quality of the watchfulness changed from the vague unease of their earliest years into something with more direction, more intention, more of the specific texture of a community organizing itself around a conclusion it had not yet fully articulated but was already, in the way of groups moving toward shared action, beginning to commit to. They sat together in the long evenings, the two of them, as they had always sat, and the world outside pressed closer. She would look at her brother in the firelight, and he would look back at her, and in the particular silence between them was every conversation they had never needed to have aloud. He knew what she felt. She knew what he observed. Between them, they understood what was coming with a clarity that their youth should not have given them, and their circumstances made impossible to avoid. The fire was very far away still, but the cold was already the cold of something approaching. And the two of them, who had always been each other's only warmth, moved a little closer together in the dark of the house and waited in the way that people wait when they know that waiting is all that remains. Outside, the English winter settled over the village like a judgment. The forest held its silence, and in the careful, watchful space between two children who had always been wrong for the world they were born into, something that had no name yet gathered itself quietly toward what it was about to become. The accusation, when it finally came, did not arrive as a single moment. It arrived the way most catastrophes arrive in small communities, slowly, and then all at once, the slow part invisible until the fast part made it visible in retrospect. There had been months of preparation in the village's collective imagination, months of small observations accumulating into a shared conclusion, months of the particular social chemistry that transforms unease into certainty and certainty into action. By the time anyone said the word aloud in a context that carried official weight, everyone already knew. The saying of it was not the beginning. It was the ratification of something the village had already, in its quiet and collective way, decided. The word was witchcraft. In the early medieval period, witchcraft was not a vague or metaphorical accusation. It was a specific charge with specific consequences, understood by everyone in the community in terms that required no elaboration. It meant a person had made arrangements with forces that existed outside the sanctioned order of the world. It meant they had access to capabilities that ordinary human beings were not supposed to possess. It meant they were dangerous in a way that ordinary danger was not, because ordinary danger could be managed with ordinary means, and this kind could not. The community's response to witchcraft was not punishment in the conventional sense. It was removal, elimination, the specific kind of destruction that the era believed would prevent the contamination from spreading or the practitioner from returning. Fire was not chosen arbitrarily. Fire was chosen because it was understood as complete. Other methods of execution left a body, and a body was a thing that could, in the cosmology of the era, persist in ways that remained troubling. Fire left nothing. Fire was the theological and practical solution to the specific problem of a person whose wrongness was believed to be fundamental, written into the substance of what they were, rather than simply into what they had chosen to do. You could not reform that kind of wrongness. You could only unmake it. The twins were children. This did not protect them in the way that a later age's sensibility might expect it to, and the community's fear of what they represented was not moderated by their age, because the fear was not really about them as individuals. It was about what they were, which was understood as something that existed independently of age or innocence, or the ordinary considerations that governed the treatment of children who were simply children. They were not, in the village's accounting, simply children. They were something that had arrived in the shape of children, and that distinction, once made, erased every other consideration. The formal process was brief. It did not require extensive deliberation because the conclusion was not in genuine dispute. The evidence presented was the evidence of accumulated whispers given official form. The cows pour milk, the elders worsen illness, the girl seen at the forest's edge, heard the boy's unsettling proximity to suffering. Each item was individually thin. Together, in the mouth of someone who had the community's trust and the community's fear at his back, they constituted a case that no one in the room was positioned or inclined to challenge. The twins were present for their own condemnation. They sat together, which was the only arrangement they would accept, and they listened to the list of grievances against them with the particular stillness that had always characterized their engagement with a world that did not entirely know what to do with them. She held her expression in careful neutrality, her dark eyes moving over the faces of the people she had known her entire life, with an attention that made several of those people look down at their hands. He sat beside her with his characteristic quality of interior distance, present in the room, and also, somehow, slightly beyond the room's full reach. They did not speak in their own defense. There was nothing to say, not because they were guilty in the way the charge required, not because they had made any arrangements with any forces, not because witchcraft, in its theological sense, had any correspondence to what they actually were, but because the room had already decided, and they were 12 years old, and the distance between what a 12-year-old child could do against a community's collective decision and what they needed to do was not a distance that words could close. The sentence was what everyone in the room had known it would be before they sat down. They were held separately from each other in the days between the sentencing and the execution, which was the cruelest thing the village did to them, crueler in certain ways than the sentence itself. They had never been separated. Their entire existence had been organized around the certainty of each other's proximity, and the removal of that certainty in the days before their deaths was a specific and deliberate additional punishment, whether the village understood it as such or not. She spent those days in a silence that the people guarding her found deeply unsettling. Sitting in the particular stillness of someone who has moved all of her interior resources toward a single point of focus. He spent them in a quietness that was different from her silence in quality. Not gathered and directed, but receded. He pulled back from the surface of his own experience in the way he had always been able to pull back. The distance that had always been his first defense, now his only one. On the morning of the execution, they were brought together again. This was practical rather than merciful. A single pyre was more efficient than two. But the effect, when they were placed near each other again, was visible to everyone present. Something in both of them changed when the distance between them closed. Not relaxed because relaxation was not available to them in any meaningful sense on that morning, but reorganized, reoriented around the center of gravity that had always defined them, that had always been each other, that had survived separation and condemnation and everything the preceding days had done to them, and was still, in the final hour, intact. The pyre was at the edge of the village, near enough to the forest that the trees were visible beyond the assembled crowd. It was early, the sky still holding the particular grey of a winter dawn that had not quite committed to becoming day. The crowd was the entire village, because these things were communal, because the community's participation in the removal was part of how the removal worked, how the village absolved itself of what it was doing by doing it together. The fire was lit. What happened in the next few minutes is the part of the story that the twins carried forward into their immortal lives without ever fully setting down. The the specific quality of fire as pain is different from every other kind of pain, which is already different from ordinary experience in ways that are impossible to communicate to someone who has not encountered it. It is total. It does not permit the mind to go elsewhere, to find the interior distance that had always been available as a retreat. It fills every available register of consciousness completely. There is nothing left over for anything else. They were aware of each other still. Across the short distance the pyre permitted, in whatever fragments of awareness the fire left available. This was the one thing that did not disappear. It was in this moment, in the specific, terrible middle of the fire, that Aro arrived. He came from the direction of the forest, which was the direction that the crowd, fixed on the pyre, was not watching. He moved with the quality of movement that vampires possess, or which is not like human movement in any way that casual observation can fully process. Too fluid, too certain, too completely without the small hesitations and adjustments that human bodies make when navigating the world. He was dressed in a way that was entirely inconsistent with the early morning, with the village, with any ordinary person who might have had reason to be present at the edge of the community at dawn. He looked old and did not look old simultaneously, in the specific way of very ancient vampires, whose physical appearance has not changed in millennia, but whose presence carries the accumulated weight of all that time. His red eyes found the pyre first. Then they found the twins within the fire, with the focused precision of someone who knows exactly what they are looking for and has the sensory apparatus to locate it without difficulty. He stood at the edge of the gathered crowd, and his expression in those first moments was the expression of a man confirming something he had traveled a significant distance to confirm. He had known about them. This is the part of the story that requires a moment of consideration, because it reframes everything that follows. Aro did not arrive by accident, and he did not arrive by chance proximity. He arrived because, in the centuries of his existence, and the comprehensive network of information that the Volturi had developed across those centuries, word of two unusual children in an English village had reached him through channels that the village itself would never have known existed. Not specific word perhaps, not detailed intelligence about the precise nature of their gifts, but enough to bring him across whatever distance he had traveled, to be present at this specific edge of the world on this specific grey morning. He moved through the crowd with a quality of authority that parted people without requiring him to make contact with them. Not aggressively, simply with a particular certainty of someone who has never, in a very long existence, needed to assert their right to be wherever they chose to be. The crowd moved aside in the way that people move aside for things they cannot entirely name, but can entirely feel. He reached the pyre. What he did next was not slow, and it was not theatrical, and it was not negotiated with the community whose sentence he was interrupting. He simply ended the burning with the focused efficiency of someone performing an action that has a clear purpose and does not require ceremony. The twins were in his arms before the crowd had fully processed what was happening, and the crowd's response, the beginning of a reaction that might, in another moment, have become violent, met his eyes and stopped. He looked at them for a long moment, just his eyes, moving over the assembled faces with an expression that communicated without any need for words, the complete irrelevance of their objections. He was 3,000 years old. He had governed the hidden world for the entirety of living vampire memory. The community's claim on the two burned children in his arms was not a claim he recognized. He turned toward the forest. The twins were barely conscious. The fire had done what fire does, and the damage was extensive. And the state they were in was the state of people who were very close to the end of something. But they were aware, in whatever fragments of awareness remained available to them, of the fact of being carried, of movement, of the smell of the forest replacing the smell of the village, of the distance between themselves and the pyre growing, and the crowd's noise dimming, and the particular quality of winter morning air against skin that the fire had made impossibly sensitive. She became aware of her brother, carried in the same arms, present in the same motion through the same dark between the trees, the center of gravity, still there. At the edge of the forest, beyond the sight of anyone in the village, Aro stopped. He looked down at the two children he was carrying with the expression he would wear, and in various forms, for the next several centuries. The expression of someone looking at something they have wanted for a very long time, and have finally, at considerable effort, acquired. There was genuine feeling in it. There always was with Aro. The feeling was real. Its relationship to other things was simply complicated. He spoke to them quietly. There is no record of exactly what he said in those first moments, in that specific configuration of forest and firelight edge and two burned children at the threshold of death. But the offer was clear enough in its essentials, because the twins understood it, and the twins accepted it. The world that had tried to burn them was behind them. Everything else was ahead. He administered the venom, and the 3 days of burning began. Different from the fire, and in certain ways not different enough, but with a direction to it, a purpose, a transformation rather than simply a destruction. The twins moved through it together, laid near each other in the dark, aware across the small distance between them in the way they had always been aware of each other, which was completely. The forest held its silence around them. The village, behind them, would tell the story of the burning for years, and in the telling, it would become something instructive, a warning about what happened to children like that. They would not know, in the village, that the warning had the ending exactly wrong. They would not know that the fire had not ended the twins, but completed them. That what stepped out of the burning was not the destruction of a threat, but the creation of something the village, and in its most fearful imaginings, had never possessed the framework to conceive. The grey English sky moved overhead, indifferent and ancient, and entirely unchanged by what had occurred beneath it. And in the dark of the forest, the 3 days continued their work. The first day was the fire continuing. That is the only honest way to describe it. The venom moved through them the way the flames had moved through them, with the same total occupation of every available register of consciousness. The same refusal to permit the mind to locate any distance from what the body was experiencing. The twins had spent their human lives developing interior retreats, private distances, the specific psychological architectures that people build when the world they inhabit is consistently hostile and the self requires protection. The transformation dismantled all of it. There was nowhere to go. There was only the burning and the duration of the burning, and the absolute certainty in the worst hours of the first day, that nothing existed or had ever existed outside of it. They were laid near each other on the forest floor, on a bed of winter bracken that Aro had arranged with a practicality that was also, in its way, a form of consideration. This was deliberate rather than incidental, because he understood enough about the twins already, from the intelligence that had brought him to that village on that specific grey morning, and from the brief and terrible clarity of their final human moments, to know that the proximity mattered, that separating them during the transformation would be its own form of cruelty, and that Aro, whatever else he was, did not practice cruelty without purpose. The small distance between them was the one fixed point in an experience that had dissolved every other fixed point. She could not have said, in those first hours, what her name was, or where she was, or what had happened to bring her to this forest floor in this condition. But she knew he was there. The awareness of him was the one thing the transformation could not reach, because it was not located in the nervous system or the senses or any of the specific biological infrastructure the venom was in the process of rewriting. It was located somewhere older than any of that, in a place the venom had no instructions to dismantle, because whatever had built it to last. He knew she was there too. In the wordless, ambient way, he had always known where she was. Across every room they had ever shared, across every moment of their short human lives. The knowing was not dependent on sight or sound, or any of the senses. The transformation was currently overwhelming. It simply persisted, the way certain things persist through the worst conditions the world can produce, not because they are invulnerable, but because they are fundamental. Aro remained nearby through the full duration. He maintained a small fire against the winter cold, tending it with the unhurried attention of someone who has arranged his schedule around a commitment he takes seriously. He had transformed others before the twins, and he would transform others after them. And he understood the arc of the 3 days with the clinical familiarity of long experience. He knew which hours were the worst. He knew the specific changes in the quality of a transforming vampire stillness that communicated progress, that indicated the venom was moving through a new system, completing a new stage of its comprehensive reconstruction. He watched Jane's face in the firelight and watched Alec beside her. And his expression across those long hours was the expression of a man who is waiting for something of extraordinary value, and who has, for the moment, all the patience that 3,000 years of existence had given him to spend. The forest around them was the specific quiet of an English winter forest, which is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a particular kind of sound. Wind moving through bare branches, the distant settling of old wood, the occasional passage of something small and nocturnal through the undergrowth. And these sounds reached the twins through the transformation in distorted and overwhelming forms. The venom's enhancement of their senses arriving before the capacity to manage what those senses were receiving, so that the ordinary quiet of the forest was not quiet at all, but a density of information their minds could not yet organize into anything coherent. Everything was too much. Everything was simultaneous and undifferentiated and relentless. The way that early transformation always is. The way that the gift of supernatural perception feels in its first hours, indistinguishable from its opposite. The second day brought a different quality to the suffering, not less intense, not in the direction of relief, not in any way that could be described as improvement, but changed in its character, and the fire of the first day had been obliterating. The fire of the second day was more specific, more surgical, as though the venom had finished its broad demolition of everything human and had turned its attention to the precise and detailed work of construction. The twins' bodies were being rebuilt from the cellular level outward, and the process of that rebuilding was not gentle, because it was not designed for gentleness. It was designed for completeness, for the production of something that would outlast every ordinary force the world could bring against it. The bones were being hardened to a density that no human skeleton approaches. The skin was being transformed into something that would deflect what human skin could not. The senses were being rebuilt entirely. New instruments installed where the old ones had been. I calibrated to a range of perceptions so far beyond the human baseline that the original versions barely registered as precedent. And beneath all of that structural reconstruction, the venom was doing its most specific and most consequential work. It was finding the deepest traits of the people it was transforming, and reading them the way a very attentive reader reads a very complex text. It was finding what was most essentially true about each of them, what was most concentrated and most foundational in the specific architecture of who they were. And it was asking a question of that essential truth. The question was, what does this become when every limiting factor of human biology is removed? What does this become when the ceiling is taken off? On the second night, in a window between one wave of the burning and the next, Alec spoke. It was not coherent speech, not in any ordinary sense. It was barely speech at all. A single word pressing through the transformation's occupation of everything with the specific urgency of something that could not wait for better conditions, that had to be said now regardless of the cost of saying it. Her name. Aro, seated near the fire, with the stillness of someone who had been perfectly still for a very long time and found this entirely comfortable, heard it. He looked at the boy, then at the girl beside him, and something in his expression shifted into a quality that was almost tenderness. Almost. The almost was not cynicism, it was precision. Aro was always precise about what he felt, even in private, perhaps especially in private. "She is here," he said quietly, into the dark between the trees. "She is right beside you. She has not moved. She is not going anywhere." A long pause, in which the fire spoke in its small, crackling voice, and the forest held its breath, and the transformation continued its relentless work. Then, from the direction of the girl, without opening her eyes, without any visible relaxation of the rigid stillness the venom had imposed on her body, in a voice that was barely a voice, and also somehow entirely hers, "I hear you." 3 words, across the small distance between them, through the worst thing either of them had ever endured, through a process that was in the explicit business of dismantling everything human and remaking it as something else entirely. 3 words that carried, in the particular frequency the twins had always communicated on, everything they had always meant to each other, compressed to its irreducible minimum. "I still here, both of us, together, still." Aro looked at them for a long moment in the firelight. Then he looked at the forest, and his expression held the specific quality of someone who has just received confirmation of something they suspected but could not be certain of until they saw it directly. The bond between them was not something the transformation would simplify. It was not something it would rationalize or reduce or absorb into the new architecture it was building. It was going to survive. It was going to survive in the same form it had always taken, which was complete and mutual and located in a place below the reach of any external force he had yet encountered. This was information. He filed it with the careful attention he brought to all information. The third day was when the gifts announced themselves. It began with Jane. The venom had been completing its work through the specific and intricate architecture of her nervous system. And in the completing, it had been moving steadily toward the trait it found at the center of everything she was. The deep, fierce, focused capacity for making others feel pain. Not physical pain in the direct sense, but the specific, targeted suffering that she had always been able to produce in the people around her. The precise location and application of anguish that had been her most fundamental feature since long before she had any conscious understanding of it. The venom did not create this capacity. It could not have created it. It found it, the way a lens finds light that was already traveling, and it concentrated it. And what emerged from that concentration was not a human trait in any longer recognizable form, and it was something that operated according to entirely different principles, something that did not require proximity or words or any of the ordinary mechanisms through which one person causes another to suffer, something that required only attention. Aro felt it when it activated for the first time. He stepped back, one step, controlled and immediate, with the precise reaction of someone who has been reached by something unexpected and is managing the response with the discipline of very long practice. His hand went briefly to his temple. The sensation was sharp and complete, and lasted only a moment before he identified its source and brought his own considerable composure to bear against it. Then he stilled, and his red eyes moved to Jane's face with an expression that was several things simultaneously, and layered in the specific way that Aro's expressions were always layered. The pain registered and catalogued and set aside. The professional assessment of what had caused it and what that meant. And beneath both of those things, rising through them with the particular warmth of genuine feeling, the deep and luminous satisfaction of a collector who has just confirmed that what he traveled a significant distance to acquire is precisely, completely, breathtakingly as extraordinary as he had allowed himself to hope. "Remarkable," he said softly. The word carried 3,000 years of accumulated experience behind it, 3,000 years of encountering extraordinary things and developing an increasingly refined sense of what truly deserved that designation. He said it the way a person says a word when they mean it completely. Remarkable. Jane did not respond. She wasn't yet at the place in the transformation where response was possible in any practical sense. But something had changed in her face, even through the rigid stillness the venom imposed. Something had arrived in it that had not been there before, a quality of settlement, of resolution, of a person becoming, in some deep structural sense, more fully what they had always been pointing toward, arriving at themselves from the direction of their own most essential nature. Alec's gift announced itself more quietly. This was entirely consistent with every other way in which Alec differed from his sister in character and approach. and it would remain consistent with those differences across every subsequent century of his existence. Where Jane's emergence was felt as a sharp and unmistakable event, a specific sensation with a clear origin and a clear effect, Alec's arrival was experienced as a change in atmosphere, a gradual, comprehensive, and eerily complete alteration in the quality of everything around him. Aro became aware of it not as something added, but as something removed. The cold of the winter forest, which had been present at the edges of his awareness in the specific way that even a vampire registers extreme temperatures, was simply no longer present. The sounds of the night, which had been the constant quiet texture of the hours, wind through branches, distant water, the small movements of nocturnal creatures in the undergrowth, were simply gone. Not blocked, not muffled, not reduced in volume, not pushed to a greater distance. Removed. Lifted gently and completely from the available inventory of experience and set aside somewhere outside the perimeter of Alec's presence with the thoroughness of someone who does careful work. Aro stood in this sudden, comprehensive, and profoundly unsettling quiet, and understood precisely what he was experiencing. Then he smiled. It was a genuine smile, full and unguarded in the way that Aro's smiles rarely were. The specific smile of a man who has spent 3,000 years assembling a collection of extraordinary things and has just encountered something that surpasses the highest point that collection had previously reached. He looked at the boy on the forest floor, at the particular quality of the stillness he produced that was so utterly different from ordinary stillness. And he felt something that was entirely real in him and that coexisted without contradiction alongside the political and strategic calculation that was also always present in everything Aro did. He was fond of them. Already, in the specific and complicated way that Aro was fond of things he valued. Genuinely, and with the full complexity of a being who had long since stopped pretending that love and use were opposites. The third day ended in the hour before dawn, when the darkness is at its most complete, and the world has not yet begun its preparations for the light. Jane opened her eyes first. The forest arrived in her consciousness with a completeness that had no precedent in anything she had previously experienced. Every branch of every tree within a range that extended far beyond what human vision could ever have reached. The cold air carrying information so dense and specific and simultaneous that it took several long seconds to begin to sort into anything organized. The sound of Aro's stillness, not the stillness of sleep, but the deliberate, chosen stillness of something that had simply decided not to move, which had its own distinctive sound when heard through ears rebuilt for precision, and the sound of her brother beside her, which was the most important sound in the inventory of everything her new senses were offering her. The absence of a heartbeat where a heartbeat should have been, a silence in his chest that matched the silence in her own, and was therefore not frightening but simply true. She sat up slowly, processing the movement of her own body with the careful attention of someone learning the controls of something new and finding them unexpectedly, entirely intuitive. Aro watched her without moving. She looked at her hands. Newly transformed vampires almost always look at their hands first, because the hands are the most immediately accessible evidence of what has changed, the most visible surface of the transformation's work. The skin was pale in a way her human skin had never approached, carrying the particular luminous quality that has no analogue in ordinary human biology, as though the light were not simply reflected from the surface, but also faintly generated within it. She turned her hands over. She pressed her fingertips together and felt the specific, total, unyielding quality of what she had become. Then she looked up at Aro, and her eyes, no longer the dark human eyes that had made people look away, but the deep burgundy of a newly transformed vampire, yet burning with a clarity that the human version had only ever gestured toward, held his with a steady directness that had always been the most defining feature of how she engaged with the world. "You saved us," she said. Her voice was new and also entirely hers, recognizable in its quality, in the particular register of someone whose voice had always carried more certainty than a child's voice was supposed to carry, but larger now, cleaner, with a resonance beneath it that the human version had only been the suggestion of. "I did," Aro said. "Why?" He considered the question with the genuine thoughtfulness he brought to things he found worth considering carefully. "Because what you are," he said, "is extraordinary, and extraordinary things deserve to continue existing." He paused. "The world made an error this morning. I corrected it." She held his gaze for a long moment, and in her expression was the specific quality of someone receiving information they intend to think about carefully later, when there is more space for it. Someone deciding provisionally that the answer is sufficient for now. Beside her, Alec opened his eyes. He looked at the canopy of bare branches above them, at the sky beyond the branches beginning its first grey suggestion of dawn. He looked at his hands briefly, then set the question of them aside in the way he set most immediate things aside. Then he looked at his sister. What passed between them in that first shared look was not a conversation. It did not need to be. And it was the confirmation of a fact that 3 days of the worst thing either of them had ever experienced had tested with every instrument available to it and had not managed to alter. The look lasted only a moment, and it contained everything. Still here. Both of them. Exactly that. Aro watched this exchange with an expression he would wear in variations across the next several centuries, every time the twins acknowledged each other in that specific, wordless, complete way of theirs. The expression of someone in the presence of something they cannot fully access and have made their peace with never fully accessing. He could touch Jane's hand and read every thought she had ever had. He could touch Alec's and receive the same. But the content of what moved between them in their shared silence was not stored in either of them individually, and therefore could not be retrieved from either of them individually. It existed only in the space between them, in the bond itself, which was the one thing in Aro's world that remained genuinely opaque to him. He had decided, somewhere in the long hours of the 3 days, that this did not trouble him, or rather, that it troubled him in a way he could live with, which for Aro amounted to the same thing. "Can you stand?" he asked them. They stood, steadily, without hesitation, without the careful negotiation with gravity that newly transformed vampires sometimes required. They stood with the particular ease of people whose bodies had just become, for the first time in their existence, exactly adequate to what they were. Aro looked at them both for a moment. These two burned children, who were no longer children, and no longer burned, who had come through the fire twice now and arrived on the other side of it, as something the village behind them had never had the imagination to fear correctly. "Then let us begin," he said. He turned toward the deeper forest, and they followed him, and the trees received them the way old things receive what comes to them, without ceremony, without comment, with the simple acknowledgement of something recognized. Behind them, the first grey light of morning touched the edge of the forest. The village was waking. Somewhere in it, people were already beginning the work of telling the story of what had happened at the pyre, the story of the children who had been burned, which would become a warning and eventually a legend and finally nothing at all, absorbed into the ordinary silence of history. They did not look back. Our Volterra is a hill town in the Tuscany region of central Italy, and it has been inhabited for longer than most European cities can trace with any confidence. The Etruscans were there before the Romans. The Romans built over what the Etruscans left. The medieval city built over what the Romans left. Each civilization laid itself down on top of the previous one, so that the ground beneath the current streets contains layer upon layer of accumulated human history, each stratum representing a world that believed itself permanent and was not. The walls of the city are ancient in the specific way of things that have been continuously maintained rather than simply preserved. Not ruins, not monuments, but living structures that have been repaired and reinforced and added to across so many centuries that the original material and the later additions have become indistinguishable, fused into something that is simply, comprehensively old. Beneath all of it, older than any of the human layers above, ran the Volturi's halls. This was where Aro brought the twins. Not immediately. The journey from England to Tuscany in the early medieval period was not a journey that could be accomplished in days, and Aro moved with the careful patience of someone who understood that what he was transporting was both extremely valuable and extremely new, and that newly transformed vampires required specific management that haste did not accommodate. He fed them on the journey, which was the first and most pressing practical requirement of their new existence, and he observed them as they learned what they were, answering their questions with the particular quality of attention he brought to things he found genuinely interesting. There were many questions. Jane asked most of them, directly, and without the hesitation that might have been expected from a child who had been through what she had been through in the previous week. She wanted to understand the mechanics of what she had become, the thirst and its management, the specific capabilities of her transformed body, the rules that governed the world she had entered. She asked about the Volturi. She asked about Aro. She asked with a directness that had always been her most defining characteristic, that exactly what was expected of her and what she would receive in return. Aro found this delightful. He answered everything with the candid thoroughness of someone who saw no advantage in concealment from people he intended to keep close for a very long time. Alec asked fewer questions and observed more, which was also entirely consistent with who he had always been. He watched Aro with the careful attention of someone constructing a detailed and accurate picture from available evidence, filing each observation in the precise interior catalogue that had always been his primary way of understanding the world. He watched his sister's interactions with Aro and read them with the specific fluency he reserved for her alone. He fed and moved and learned the capabilities of his new body with a quiet thoroughness that Aro noted and appreciated without drawing attention to, because drawing attention to Alec's observational nature would have been counterproductive, and Aro understood this immediately. When they arrived in Volterra, approaching through the Tuscan countryside in the particular blue hour before dawn that made the hill town above them look like something painted rather than built, Jane stopped walking for a moment and looked up at it. "This is home now," she said. It was not a question. "If you choose it," Aro said beside her. She looked at him sideways, with the expression she used when she found an answer technically accurate and practically evasive. "And if we don't choose it? Then you are free to go anywhere in the world that interests you," Aro said pleasantly. "Though I think you will find, after you have seen what is below those walls, that the world offers very little that compares." She looked back up at the city for a moment. Then she continued walking. The halls beneath Volterra were everything that the village in Huntingdon had not been. They were ancient and vast and lit by the particular quality of light that exists in places built before the assumption of natural illumination, torchlight and candlelight that carved the stone walls into warmth and shadow in equal measure. They were populated by beings whose beauty was the specific beauty of vampires, complete, inhuman, and carrying the particular quality of things that have been exactly what they are for a very long time. The Volturi guard moved through the halls with the practiced ease of people who have inhabited the same space for centuries, and the space itself had the quality of somewhere that had been arranged around specific inhabitants so long that it had taken on the character of those inhabitants, the way that very old houses take on the character of the families who have lived in them across generations. Aro's brothers received the twins with reactions that were consistent with their established characters. Caius looked at them with the sharp, assessing attention he brought to most things, and what moved in his expression was not warmth but something adjacent to approval. The specific approval of someone who values capability above nearly everything else and can recognize it even in unexpected forms. He was not a patient being, and he was not a gentle one, and he had no instinct toward the particular fondness Aro was already displaying. But he understood what the twins were, understood it with the tactical precision that defined his approach to everything, and understanding shaded, in Caius, into a form of respect that was more reliable than affection. "Young," he said, looking at them. "Yes," Aro agreed, with the specific pleasure of someone whose point is being made for them. "Extraordinarily young. And yet..." Caius looked at Jane for a moment longer. She looked back at him without flinching, with the steady, unapologetic directness that had unnerved people twice her size her entire life, and something shifted fractionally in Caius's expression. Not softening, more like the recalibration of an initial assessment. Marcus barely looked up. This was not specific to the twins. Marcus barely looked up for most things, existing in the permanent state of melancholy detachment that had defined him since the death of his wife did him, a loss so profound that it had effectively removed him from active engagement with the world while leaving his body in it. He sat in his chair in the main hall with the quality of someone who is present as a courtesy to the people around him, and for no other reason, and he turned his eyes toward the twins with the brief, uninterested attention of someone confirming a fact they already know. Then he looked at them a moment longer than he had intended to. His eyes moved between them, and something in his expression changed. Something very small, almost imperceptible, but present. he had a gift for seeing the bonds between people, the threads of relationship that connected beings to each other, and what he saw between the twins was something he had not encountered in a very long time. A bond of a completeness and a depth that the centuries had not produced in very many of the beings he had observed. He looked at it the way someone looks at something that reminds them of something they have lost, which was the only way Marcus looked at anything that reached him anymore. He said nothing. He returned to his characteristic stillness. But he had seen them. The existing guard received the twins with the range of responses that any new additions to an established community produce. There was curiosity, and there was the particular wariness that beings of great power develop around other beings of great power, and there was the social architecture of an institution that had existed in its current form for centuries and had developed across those centuries its own internal hierarchies and alliances and tensions that any new member had to navigate. Felix was the first member of the guard to speak to them directly. He was physically the largest vampire in the Volturi's ranks, with the easy confidence of someone whose capabilities had never been meaningfully challenged. And he approached the twins with the good-natured assessment of someone who classifies new acquaintances primarily by whether they are interesting. "I've heard about the gifts," he said to Jane, with the specific directness of someone who considers social preamble wasteful. "Is it true you've never failed?" Jane looked at him. "I have never had occasion to fail," she said. Felix considered this. "You'll have occasion here," he said, not unkindly. "Eventually everyone does. Then I will have occasion to demonstrate that the general principle has exceptions," Jane said. Felix looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed. A genuine laugh, surprised out of him. The laugh of someone who had not expected to be entertained and found that they were. "All right," he said. "All right." It was, in its way, at the beginning of something that would function as friendship across the subsequent centuries, in the specific form that friendship takes between beings whose relationship to violence and power makes ordinary warmth complicated. Dimitri, whose gift of tracking made him the Volturi's most indispensable hunter, assessed the twins with the professional interest of someone whose work required accurate evaluation of other people's capabilities. He was quieter than Felix and more precise, and his observations were delivered sparingly and with a weight of genuine consideration. "The combination of your gifts is tactically complete," he said to them one evening, in the early weeks of their residence, his tone purely analytical. "Jane's gift requires a conscious mind to receive it. Alec's gift removes consciousness from the equation entirely, and together there is no defensive configuration that addresses both simultaneously." "We know," Alec said. It was the most words he had offered any member of the guard unprompted in the weeks since their arrival, and Dimitri noted this with the attention he brought to all relevant information. "Good," Dimitri said simply. "It is better to understand what you are." The early months in Volterra were the period of the twins learning what their existence within the Volturi structure actually meant in practical terms. They learned the law, the single overriding law that the Volturi enforced with the consistency of 3,000 years of institutional commitment, the law of secrecy, of the careful maintenance of the boundary between the hidden world and the human world above. They learned the guard's protocols, its hierarchies, its specific culture of discipline and capability. They fed in the way of the Volturi, on the humans who came to Volterra as tourists and left through a different door than the one they had entered. And they found that the thirst, which had been the most immediately consuming feature of their new existence, became manageable with a rapidity that Aro observed with quiet satisfaction. Jane adapted to the Volturi's world with the ease of someone who had always been built for a world that valued what she had to offer. The human village had feared her gift as evidence of wrongness. The Volturi valued it as evidence of extraordinary worth. The realignment of her context produced a realignment of her relationship to herself that was not uncomplicated. Nothing about Jane was ever uncomplicated, but was, in its fundamental direction, it toward a stability she had never previously accessed. She trained with focus and without complaint, refining the precision of her gift with the thoroughness of someone who takes their capabilities seriously as a form of self-respect. She established her position in the guard's hierarchy, not through aggression, but through the simple, consistent demonstration of what she could do and what she was prepared to do, which settled the question of her standing more efficiently than any social negotiation could have. Alec moved through the early months with his characteristic quality of careful observation. He learned everything and displayed the evidence of learning selectively, which was the approach that came most naturally to him, and which was also, as it happened, the approach most suited to long-term survival within an institution as complex as the Volturi. He understood Aro with a clarity and a speed that was not quite comfortable, and he filed that understanding in the same place he filed everything. Carefully, precisely, and without immediate action. His gift refined itself as he worked with it, developing a control that the raw version he had emerged from transformation with did not yet possess. He learned the range of it, the specific dispersal pattern of the sensory deprivation he could project, the rate at which it moved, and the perimeter he could extend it to. He learned to direct it with increasing precision, to target specific individuals within a group, rather than simply releasing it into the general space around him. This required a quality of focused control that was different from the passive expression of the gift he had first experienced, and he approached the work of developing that control with the patient, methodical attention that defined his engagement with everything he decided to take seriously. Aro watched all of this with the specific satisfaction of someone whose investment is producing exactly the returns they anticipated. He spent time with the twins individually and together, in the way of someone who understood that his relationship with each of them was distinct, and that managing those relationships with care was worth the attention it required. With Jane, his interactions carried the particular warmth of two people who understand each other's intensity and do not require it to be softened. With Alec, they carried a quieter quality, a mutual recognition between two beings who both preferred observation to performance and found each other's company restful for exactly that reason. He called them, in those early years, his most treasured members of the guard. He said it in company, which some members of the guard noted with varying degrees of equanimity, and he said it in private, which meant it was not performance. The favoritism was real and it was not concealed. The twins understood it for what it was, genuine in his feeling and inseparable from his function, love and utility residing in the same gesture without either cancelling the other out. They had been saved by this man. They had been given existence, purpose, and a place in the world by him. The gratitude that produced was real. The complexity that surrounded the gratitude was also real, and they were not simple enough to mistake one for the absence of the other. But they were here, in the stone halls beneath an ancient Tuscan hill town, in the company of beings who valued exactly what had nearly gotten them killed, fed and purposeful and together. For two children who had stood at a burning with nothing but each other, it was more than the world had ever previously offered them. And they understood, with the clear-eyed pragmatism that had always been their shared inheritance, that understanding what you have been given is the beginning of knowing how to keep it. There is a particular kind of power that does not announce itself. It does not need to. The most absolute forms of power in any world, human or otherwise, are the ones that have moved so far past the need for demonstration that their existence functions as demonstration enough. The threat that never has to be made because everyone in the room already knows it is there. The capability so thoroughly established across such a long history of application that its mere presence changes the calculation of every other person present before a single action has been taken. Jane's gift became this kind of power. It did not begin that way. In the early decades of her existence within the Volturi, she was extraordinary but not yet legendary, capable but not yet the specific fixed point of fear that her name would eventually represent in the broader vampire world. The legend was built the way most legends are built, through accumulation, through the slow and consistent addition of instances to a record, each one confirming what the previous ones had established, until the record itself became the argument, and the argument became the fact, and the fact became the kind of truth that does not require repetition, because it has passed beyond the territory where repetition is necessary. What the gift actually does, in the precise, mechanical terms that matter for understanding its full significance, is this. Jane projects the perfect illusion of pain directly into the nervous system of her target. Not the suggestion of pain, not a weakened or approximate version of it, the complete, total, physiologically indistinguishable experience of agony received by the body and the mind as entirely real, and producing every response that actual physical damage would produce. The locking of muscles, the flooding of consciousness with a single consuming sensation, the absolute evacuation of every other thought or intention or capability, without any actual physical damage occurring. The body is not harmed. The body simply believes, completely and without reservation, that it is being destroyed. This distinction matters for several reasons, the most significant of which is tactical. Actual physical damage can be endured. Vampires are extraordinarily difficult to physically harm, and those who have survived centuries of conflict have developed across that time a genuine tolerance for physical pain that allows them to function through it. The pain of Jane's gift does not build this tolerance because it does not produce the physical damage that tolerance is calibrated against. Every application of her gift is experienced at full intensity, regardless of how many times a target has encountered it before. There is no habituation. There is no building a resistance. There is only the illusion complete each time, and the total incapacitation it produces. She requires focused attention to deploy it. The gift operates through her eyes, through the specific quality of concentrated intention that she directs at a target, and requires that she hold that focus for the duration of the effect. She can maintain it indefinitely. There is no established limit to how long she can hold a target in the grip of the illusion once it has been activated. She can release it instantly and reapply it to the same or a different target without any apparent recovery period. She can, in principle, hold multiple targets simultaneously, though this requires a division of her attention that reduces the precision of the effect on each. In practice, she rarely needed to do any of this. In practice, one application was almost always sufficient, because the experience of Jane's gift is not simply painful. It is, for most of its recipients, the most consuming and most helpless experience of their immortal existence. Vampires who have survived battles, who have endured physical damage that would have killed any human being many times over, who have faced opponents of extraordinary capability and come through it with the particular hardness of creatures who have been genuinely tested, describe the experience of Jane's gift with a quality of dread that their other memories of danger do not produce. It reaches something deeper than physical courage. It reaches the specific terror of having your own body turned entirely against you, of being imprisoned in your own nervous system with no exit and no appeal. Jane understood this. She had always understood it, in the same wordless way she had understood the human version of her gift from childhood. The precise location of the places where people were most vulnerable, the specific application of attention that produced the maximum effect. The supernatural version simply operated at a scale that the human version had only gestured toward, and she deployed it with the particular efficiency of someone who had never been confused about what her gift was for. The early enforcement actions established the pattern. A coven in the Eastern Mediterranean, 3 vampires who had fed publicly and conspicuously enough to produce human witnesses who were not easily managed, received a visit from the Volturi guard. The coven's leader was an older vampire, several centuries old, confident in his own capabilities and in the capabilities of his companions. He had not encountered Jane before. Most vampires in the broader world had not, in those early decades. Her reputation was established within the Volturi's immediate sphere, but had not yet propagated across the full geography of the vampire world. He looked at her when she arrived with the guard, taking in her size and her apparent age, with the specific miscalculation that Jane had been producing in people since the first day of her human life. She looked like a child. She moved like something else entirely, but the visual impression was of a child, and the visual impression was what the coven leader processed first. He directed his first challenge at Felix, who was the most physically imposing member of the group present, which was the obvious tactical choice and the wrong one. Jane looked at him. He dropped. It was not dramatic in the way that physical combat is dramatic. There was no impact, no visible force, no moment of resistance and overcoming. He simply went from standing to the floor in the specific total way of something whose entire voluntary motor function has been instantaneously suspended, and the sound he made was the sound of something that has been removed from the category of capable and placed in the category of suffering so quickly that the transition had no middle. His companion stood completely still, because the instinct of beings who have just watched something incomprehensible happen to someone they know is to stop moving entirely until they understand what they are dealing with. "That is sufficient," Aro said pleasantly, from several feet behind Jane. She released the gift. The coven leader lay on the ground for a moment longer, breathing in the specific, careful way of someone whose body is confirming with disbelief and enormous relief that it is still intact. The Coven's cooperation with the subsequent proceedings was complete and immediate, and this is how most of Jane's enforcement work operated across the centuries. Not through extended conflict, but through the rapid and total demonstration of something the other party had no framework to defend against. The encounter with the Mediterranean Coven was early and relatively minor. The encounters that followed were larger and more complex and more politically significant, and Jane's role in them was always the same. The point at which the other party understood that resistance had moved from the category of difficult to the category of meaningless. Her relationship to the work was not simple. She was not sadistic in the way that the simplest reading of her gift and her history might suggest. She did not take pleasure in suffering for its own sake, and did not linger over the application of her gift with the enjoyment of someone who finds cruelty intrinsically satisfying. What she experienced in the deployment of her gift against those who had tested the Volturi's law or threatened the Volturi's authority was something more specific and more honest than simple pleasure. It was the satisfaction of competence, the particular clean feeling of doing the thing you were built for with complete precision and complete effect. The gift was hers, the most fundamental expression of who she was, and using it in the service of a purpose she had genuinely committed to produce the specific contentment of alignment, of a person and their capabilities and their values all pointing in the same direction simultaneously. This was not uncomplicated. She knew this. She had always been intelligent enough to know when something was not uncomplicated, and wise enough not to spend too much time examining the complications in detail. Some examinations were not useful. Some things were better understood in their outlines than in their interiors. What was not complicated was the record. In the centuries between her transformation and the events of the saga's present timeline, Jane directed her gift at every target Aro required her to address. She did not fail. Not once, across an application history that extended over hundreds of years and included vampires of extraordinary age and power, and, in several cases, vampires who possessed their own gifts that should theoretically have offered some protection against external supernatural influence. None of it mattered against Jane, because the mechanisms that other gifts used to interfere with or deflect supernatural influence operated at a level that her gift did not engage with. Her gift did not ask permission of the nervous system. It did not negotiate with the mind's defenses. It simply arrived, and the arrival was total. Her relationship with Alec within this context was the most important relationship of her existence, as it had always been. The tactical complementarity of their gifts was real and was understood by everyone in the Volturi structure. But the relationship between them was not primarily tactical and had never been. It was the continuation of what they had always been to each other, expressed now in the specific form that immortal existence and centuries of shared work within the same institution gave it. He was the only person in her world who was not, in some sense, subject to her. Not because he was immune to her gift. She had never directed it at him, and would not have been able to maintain the focus required if she had tried, which was itself a form of information about the specific nature of their bond. But because his orientation toward her was not organized around the fear that organized everyone else's orientation toward her. He was not afraid of her. He had never been afraid of her. He had seen her before the gift, had known her in the specific way of twins who have spent their entire shared childhood in the interior of each other's reality. And the person he knew was not the instrument of absolute incapacitation that the rest of the vampire world experienced when they heard her name. She was his sister, and the distinction mattered more than anything else. She was, with him, something closer to the child she had been than with anyone else in the world, not diminished by it, not reduced to it, simply more completely herself. The Jane that existed in her brother's company was the full version, the one that contained the intensity and the ferocity and the gift, and also the things that existed alongside those qualities in the interior of a person who had survived what she had survived and built what she had built, and who was, underneath the architecture of all of it, still the girl from Huntingdon, who had always known exactly where the vulnerable places were and had spent her life deciding what to do with that knowledge. The first time her gift failed was not the first time anyone had tried to defend against it. There had been attempts across the centuries. Vampires with gifts of mental protection. Vampires who had developed various strategies for managing supernatural influence through long practice and deliberate cultivation of internal defenses. None of them had succeeded. The attempts had been noted and then set aside, because attempts that fail consistently enough eventually stop generating new information and simply confirm what is already known. The girl in Volterra did not attempt to defend against Jane's gift. She had no awareness that it was being directed at her. She had no framework for understanding what Jane could do, or what the focused attention of Jane's eyes in her direction meant. She simply sat in the throne room of the Volturi, young and human and brown-haired and quiet, and Jane directed the full precision of a gift that had never failed in all its centuries of application directly at her nervous system, and received nothing in return. Jane processed this result with the specific quality of someone encountering a category of experience that their existing frameworks cannot immediately accommodate. She tried again with the concentrated precision she brought to difficult targets. The same result. She held the focus for longer than she ever needed to hold it, directing everything she had at the space this girl occupied, and the space this girl occupied returned her attention to her with the completeness of something that simply did not register the transmission. The serenity that was Jane's public face developed a hairline fracture along its edges. Something cold and very precise moved beneath it, and the specific internal response of someone whose most fundamental certainty has just been brought into question by evidence they cannot dismiss. She looked at the girl. She looked at Edward beside her, who was watching Jane with an expression that carried, beneath its careful neutrality, the very specific quality of someone who knows exactly what they are witnessing and understands that the wisest response is silence. She looked back at the girl, who was looking back at her with the mild, steady quality of someone who had no idea that anything of significance had just occurred. No idea that the most feared gift in the vampire world had just met its only exception. No idea that the architecture of fear that Jane had spent centuries building, stone by patient stone, had just encountered the one surface it could not penetrate. Jane said nothing. She did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would not make the situation significantly worse, and she understood this with the precise situational intelligence that had always been as much a part of her as the gift itself. But she did not forget it. She had never forgotten anything, and she was not going to begin with this. There is a difference between darkness and the absence of light. Darkness is a condition of the world. It has texture and depth and the specific quality of something present, something that exists as a thing in itself, rather than simply as the negation of something else. The absence of light is different. It is not a condition. It is a removal. The taking away of something that was there, our leaving behind not darkness, but a void that does not have the properties of darkness, because it does not have properties at all. It simply is not in the place where something was. Alec's gift is the absence of light. This is the distinction that most people who have not encountered it firsthand fail to make. And the failure matters because it determines whether you understand what his gift actually is, or whether you understand only what it sounds like. It sounds, in description, like a less extreme version of Jane's gift. She causes suffering. He removes sensation. One produces something terrible, and the other removes something necessary. And in the comparative accounting that people instinctively apply to supernatural capabilities, the one that produces something terrible tends to register as worse, and people who've experienced both describe the accounting differently. Every one of them. Jane's gift is total and consuming, and unlike anything else in the range of experience available to a vampire. But it is experience. It is the self, fully present, fully conscious, in possession of every faculty and every memory and every sense of being a continuous, existing person. And in agony, the self is entirely intact. Only its condition has been changed. And because the self is intact, the suffering has a container. It has a person inside it who is, however helplessly, still there. Alec's gift removes the container. What he projects is a progressive sensory deprivation so complete that its endpoint is the effective cessation of experienced existence. It begins at the edges of perception, sight dimming at the periphery first, and sound losing its upper registers, the sense of temperature and pressure against the skin becoming approximate and then absent. It moves inward from there, methodically, with the unhurried thoroughness of something that has never needed to hurry because it has never failed to arrive. The proprioceptive sense goes next. The awareness of where your own body is in space, the continuous unconscious map of your own physical existence that most people never notice because it has never been taken from them. Then the deeper connections, the sense of occupying a body at all, the boundary between self and void, which most people have never had reason to think about because it has always simply been there, begins to dissolve. What remains at the furthest extent of the gift's effect is not darkness, not pain, not fear, because fear requires a self to experience it, and the self has been effectively removed from the equation. What remains is a void that the person inside it cannot experience as a void, because the apparatus required to experience anything has been suspended. They are present in the physical sense, breathing, intact, their body continuing its automatic functions without input from the consciousness that is no longer available to direct them. But they are gone, in the sense that matters, absent from their own existence while technically still occupying it. Vampires who have survived the full application of Alec's gift and return from it describe the afterward as worse than the during, because the during cannot be remembered as experience. There is no memory of it. Hype because memory requires the engagement of a consciousness that was not present. What they remember is the before and then the after, with nothing between them but a gap that the mind cannot fill and cannot stop trying to fill. The specific horror of a blank in your own continuity. The knowledge that something was done to you completely and you were not there for any of it. This is what Alec could do. This is what he learned in the early years of his existence within the Volturi to do with increasing precision and control. The gift in his raw form, as it emerged from his transformation, was not yet the instrument it became. It dispersed outward from him in all directions with an indiscriminate reach. The way a new and powerful capability often expresses itself before the person possessing it has developed the control to direct it, and in those first months, his proximity produced the early stages of its effect in everyone around him. A slight dimming at the edges of perception, a gentle softening of the immediate sensory environment, nothing that reached the depths of the gift's full potential, but enough to be noticeable to beings as perceptive as the Volturi's guard. They were careful around him in those early months, not frightened. Most of them had existed too long and seemed too much to be frightened by the early stages of something they could step away from, but respectful of the specific quality of what he was developing in a way they were not always respectful of things that did not directly affect their own experience. Felix kept a slightly greater distance than usual, and Dimitri noted the effect with the analytical attention he brought to all tactically relevant information and adjusted his proximity accordingly. Even Aro, who valued the gift above almost anything else in his collection, was measured in his approach to Alec in those early months, engaging with him at the careful distance of someone who understands that a new and powerful thing requires time to become safe to be near. Alec worked on it with the patient, methodical focus that was his defining approach to everything he decided to master. He learned the gift the way he had always learned things, from the inside out, through careful observation of what it actually did, rather than what he assumed it should do, building his understanding from evidence rather than from theory. He practiced the containment first, learning to hold the gift's effect within a defined perimeter, rather than allowing it to disperse freely. Then the direction, learning to project it toward a specific target, rather than simply releasing it into the surrounding space. Then the gradation, the ability to apply the gift at varying intensities, rather than always at its full depth, which was the most delicate and the most practically significant of the controls he developed. It took decades to achieve the level of precision he eventually reached. This was not slow by any meaningful standard. Most capabilities of this complexity would take far longer to develop to this degree of refinement, and many would never reach it. But Alec did not measure his progress against the general standard. He measured it against the specific standard of what he needed the gift to do, and he worked until it did that completely. The tactical thinking behind the gift's refined deployment was something he developed in close conversation with Dimitri and with Aro himself, both of whom understood the military and strategic dimensions of supernatural capability with a thoroughness of experience. The gift, in its fully refined form, was not a weapon in the conventional sense. It was a neutralizer. Its purpose was not to destroy, but to remove, to take a situation from the category of contested and place it in the category of resolved before any of the messier dynamics of actual conflict had a chance to develop. In most enforcement situations, the ideal deployment sequence was Alec first, Jane as necessary. Alec's gift, released across a space where opposition was assembled, had removed the opposition's capacity to act or respond before any physical engagement began. Jane's gift was then available as a precision instrument for individuals who had somehow remained outside the range of Alec's effect, or who required specific, targeted attention for reasons beyond simple incapacitation. Together, the sequence was essentially without answer. There was no defensive configuration that addressed both simultaneously. You could not fight what you could not reach, and Alec removed the capacity to reach anything before the fight could begin. Aro understood this complementarity with a specific appreciation of a strategist looking at a perfect system. He had spent 3,000 years assembling individual capabilities into something collectively greater than the sum of its parts, and in the twins, he had found the most complete expression of that principle that his centuries of collection had produced. Their gifts were not merely additive. They were, in combination, something categorically different from either one alone. Alec's personality in relationship to his gift had a specific quality that distinguished him from Jane in ways that went beyond the obvious differences in how their gifts operated. Where Jane's relationship to her capability was direct and deliberate. She knew what it did. She understood what it meant. She deployed it with a clarity of intention that made no apologies. Alec's relationship to his was more interior, more reflective, more given to the kind of extended consideration that he brought to most things but rarely displayed. He was aware that what his gift produced was, the accounting of experienced suffering, arguably worse than what Jane's produced. He had heard the descriptions. He had observed the aftermath of the full application of his gift on beings who subsequently recovered and attempted to articulate what they had experienced and the gap they all described. The missing time, the continuity broken, the self temporarily vacated from its own existence, was something he carried a knowledge of that Jane, whose gift left its recipients entirely present for every moment of what it did to them, did not carry in quite the same way. He did not discuss this. It was not the kind of thing he discussed, and the Volturi was not an environment that rewarded that kind of reflection. But it was present in him in the same quiet, interior way that most things were present in him. Filed, acknowledged, are held without being resolved, because some things were not available for resolution, and the attempt to resolve them was simply a different form of avoidance. His relationship with Jane was the place where none of this required discussion, because none of it required articulation. She knew what he carried, as she always had, without needing him to say it. And he knew her in the same complete and wordless way. The dynamic between them within the Volturi structure was the continuation of what it had always been. Two people who were their fullest selves only in each other's company, who moved through a world that found them formidable and found it, most of the time, insufficient, and returned to each other as the one consistently sufficient thing. In the field, they were a unit in the specific way of people who have worked together so long and so completely that individual decision-making has been largely replaced by a shared situational intelligence. They did not need to communicate about tactical choices in most situations because they had developed, across centuries of enforcement work, a mutual understanding of what each of them was going to do in any given configuration that made communication largely redundant. She knew when he was going to deploy the gift before he deployed it. He knew when she was going to use hers before she turned her eyes toward a target. They moved through the work in a kind of choreography that had been refined over hundreds of years into something that looked, to outside observers, almost effortless. It was not effortless, but it was the closest thing to effortless that either of them had found in their immortal lives, which was itself a form of grace. The clearing in Forks, in the December of the saga's final confrontation, was the first time Alec's gift had been stopped. He released it in the way he had released it in hundreds of enforcement situations across the centuries, with the calm precision of someone performing an action so thoroughly practiced that it requires no particular attention. He watched it move across the clearing in the visible shimmer that it produced in cold air, reaching toward the assembled group with the unhurried certainty of something that has never failed to arrive at its destination. It reached the girl, the brown-haired girl from Forks who had been in the throne room in Volterra 2 years earlier, and the same girl who had sat in Jane's direct attention without receiving anything from it. The shimmer reached her and encountered something it had no instructions for, something that existed in the air around her as a boundary without visible architecture, and it stopped. Alec watched this with the specific quality of attention of someone observing a result that their existing understanding cannot immediately account for. He had never seen his gift stop. He had never seen him meet a surface and fail to pass through. The concept of it not arriving had no precedent in his centuries of experience, no framework in which to place it, no prior instance to compare it against. He watched the shimmer curl against the edge of her presence and go no further, held at a perimeter that moved when she moved, and that extended outward when she extended it deliberately to cover the people standing nearest to her, that remained absolute regardless of how he adjusted the angle or the intensity of the projection. He did not, in that moment, look at Jane, but he knew without looking that she was watching the same thing he was watching, and arriving at the same understanding he was arriving at. The understanding that the exception they had each encountered separately in Volterra was not a fluke of circumstance or a temporary anomaly to be explained and set aside. It was structural, it was real, and it had just, in the cold December air of a clearing in the Pacific Northwest, demonstrated its full scope in front of the entire assembled force of the Volturi and every witness gathered against them. His gift had not failed. His gift was perfect, and had always been perfect, and continued to be exactly what it was. The girl was simply, completely, and apparently permanently outside its reach. Alec filed this with the same precision he filed everything, in the interior catalogue that had been his primary way of understanding the world since long before his transformation. He filed it without expression, without visible response, with the characteristic stillness of someone who has learned across centuries that the most important information is best received quietly. And then he waited with the patience of something very old to see what the world was going to do next. Centuries are not experienced the way years are experienced. This is one of the things about immortal existence that human frameworks consistently fail to account for, and not because the failure is inevitable, but because the human experience of time is so thoroughly organized around its scarcity that imagining time without scarcity requires a restructuring of perception that is genuinely difficult to perform from the inside of a mortal life. For humans, time is the medium through which loss occurs. Every year is a year further from the beginning and closer to the end, and the awareness of that trajectory, even when it operates below conscious attention, shapes how each moment is weighted and remembered and mourned. Time feels like it means something because there is not very much of it. For vampires, and particularly for vampires as old as the twins eventually became, time operates differently, not without texture. The centuries were not experienced as an undifferentiated expanse, as one long, featureless passage from one point to another. They had their own internal landscape, their own variations of quality and intensity and significance. But the relationship to loss that gives human time its particular weight was altered, because the specific losses that structure a human life, the losses of people, of youth, of the future that keeps narrowing, were replaced by a different relationship to duration that was not better or worse, but was genuinely other. The twins had each other. This is the foundational fact of their immortal lives, and the lens through which every other aspect of that life must be understood. They had the Volturi and Volterra, and the work, and the centuries of accumulated experience that all of those things produced. But the central organizing fact was the bond, which had survived everything the world had directed at it, and had arrived in immortality not weakened by the trials of its human period, but concentrated by them, clarified, stripped of everything that was not essential, and left with only what was. The long centuries shaped them in specific ways that deserve examination, because who the twins were when the saga's present timeline arrived was not who they had been when they stepped out of the English forest with Aro. Transformation had made them what they were in their fundamental structure. The centuries had made them what they were in their particular and individual expression of that structure. Jane hardened. This is the accurate word, and it requires unpacking because hardening, as a description of a person's development across time, carries implications that the simple word does not fully convey. She did not become colder in the sense of becoming less herself, less present, less engaged with the world around her. She became more precisely and more completely herself, and the self she was did not soften with familiarity and security the way some people soften when they are given a world that values them. She took the security the Volturi offered and used it to build something more refined and more exact out of what she had always been, the way a tool is refined through use into a sharper and more precise version of its original form. The serenity that became her defining public quality was developed across those early centuries as a deliberate construction rather than a natural state. She was not, at her interior, serene. She was intensely felt, deeply reactive, possessed of a ferocity of inner life that had always been the engine of everything she was. The serenity was the surface she learned to maintain over that interior, the specific discipline of a person who understands that the most effective form of her particular kind of power was the kind that did not advertise itself. The stillness was the control, And the control was not repression, it was refinement. The ferocity beneath it did not diminish with the centuries. It became more precise. She developed across the long centuries of enforcement work and institutional life a relationship to her own gift that was more complex than the simple deployment of a capability. She understood it as an expression of herself in a way that went beyond its tactical function, and she tended that understanding with the same attention she brought to everything she decided was worth taking seriously. The gift was hers in the deepest sense, the most fundamental feature of her nature given its fullest form, and she treated it accordingly, with precision, with respect for what it was and what it was capable of, never carelessly, never excessively, always with the full awareness of someone who understood that the thing they were using was also, in the most essential sense, the thing they were. Alec changed across the centuries in ways that were less visible but equally significant, where Jane's development was a deepening and refining of what she had always been. Alec's was more lateral, an expansion of his understanding of the world around him, much an accumulation of observations about the nature of power and institution, and the specific dynamics of the Volturi structure that built across the long centuries into something that resembled wisdom, in the way that long, careful observation always eventually resembles wisdom. He watched. This had always been his nature, and the centuries did not change it, only gave it more material to work with and more context in which to place what it found. He watched Aro across the decades and centuries with the specific attention of someone who understood that the person they were most in debt to was also the person whose nature it was most important to understand accurately. He watched the Guard, its internal dynamics and its individual members, and the way those members changed across time as some departed and others were added. He watched the human world above them, the city of Volterra and its inhabitants, and the slow transformation of the civilization that surrounded and unknowingly sheltered the ancient institution beneath it. He was not cynical about what he observed. Cynicism was a form of conclusion, and Alec preferred to remain in the territory of observation without forcing premature conclusions. He held what he saw with the patience of someone who understood that the full meaning of a thing was often not available until significantly more time had passed than the immediate moment offered. He was, in this sense, suited to immortality in a way that not all vampires were. The ones who struggled with the long centuries were often the ones who needed resolution, who needed the arc of events to arrive at its endpoint so they could understand what the middle had meant. Alec did not need resolution. He was comfortable in the middle of things, in the ongoing process of understanding that never fully arrived at its destination. The work itself, the enforcement actions, the investigations, the visits to covens and individuals who had violated or were suspected of violating the Volturi's law, accumulated across the centuries into a record that was simultaneously the history of the vampire world's management and the autobiography of the twins' immortal lives. They went where Aro sent them, which was everywhere the vampire world's maintenance required attention, which was across 3,000 miles and several hundred years, a great deal of places and a great many situations, and there were the simple cases, which were the majority. Covens who had fed publicly and required either correction or removal. individual vampires who had created others without authorization and needed to understand that the authorization existed for reasons. Young vampires who had not yet learned the law and required the specific form of education that the Volturi's presence provided. These cases were resolved efficiently and left little residue, filed in the record of the institution's work without the weight of significance. There were the complicated cases, which were fewer but more defining. Situations where the law's application required judgment rather than simply execution, where the specific configuration of circumstances produced questions that the law's simple statement did not immediately answer. And these were the cases that Aro attended to most directly, bringing his 3,000 years of accumulated governance to bear on situations that his less experienced guard members might have resolved too quickly or too simply. The twins were present for many of these, and the education they received in them was an education not in the law itself but in the nature of institutional judgment, in how an entity like the Volturi maintained its authority not only through force, but through the specific quality of its decision-making, the appearance of consistency that required, at its foundation, a genuine consistency of principle. Aro discussed these cases with them sometimes, in the long evenings in Volterra, between the demands of the institution's business, and not as equals. The power differential was always present and was never pretended away, but with the specific quality of engagement he brought to minds he found interesting. He was genuinely curious about how they thought, about what they observed, and how they processed what they observed. And his curiosity was not performance. He found the twins interesting in the way he found most extraordinary things interesting, which was comprehensively and without entirely separating the interest from the investment. "What do you make of it?" he asked Jane once, after a particularly complex enforcement situation in the Eastern Territories had been resolved in a way that had required more judgment than force. Why, when the law and the outcome it would produce are not the same thing? Jane considered this with the directness she always brought to his questions. "The law exists to produce a specific outcome," she said. "Secrecy, the protection of the world. If applying the law in a particular case would undermine that outcome rather than serve it, then the application is wrong, regardless of whether it follows the letter correctly." Aro looked at her with the expression he wore when something had confirmed a high expectation. And the danger in that reasoning? That everyone who wants to violate the law can construct a version of that argument to justify it, she said, without pause. He smiled. "Yes," he said, "exactly that." These conversations were not frequent, but they were consistent across the centuries, and they were part of what built in Jane a relationship to the institution she served that went beyond simple loyalty. She understood it. She understood its purpose and its mechanisms and its vulnerabilities and the specific logic of its structure in a way that most members of the Guard, who operated primarily within the structure rather than reflecting on it, did not. This understanding made her more effective in her role and also, in ways she did not examine in detail, more thoroughly committed to it than simple gratitude for being saved could account for. Alec watched these conversations with Jane and Aro with the attention he brought to all important things, filing each exchange in the catalogue alongside everything else he had observed across the years. He participated less and understood perhaps more. This was their dynamic, as it had always been. She engaged directly, and he observed from the position of someone who trusted that observation, sustained long enough and applied with sufficient rigor, would eventually tell him everything he needed to know. Their relationship with Felix across the centuries deepened into something that functioned as genuine companionship without ever becoming the specific closeness that the twins reserved for each other. Felix was consistent in ways that were valuable in an immortal companion. Reliably good-humoured, reliably capable, reliably uncomplicated in his orientation toward the work and the institution and the people he had decided to like. He provided a kind of ballast in the twins' world, a counterweight to the specific intensity of their own dynamic and the specific intensity of Volterra's internal politics. "You two are the strangest people I have ever met," Felix told them once, entirely affectionately, after some centuries of shared service had given him sufficient standing to say it. "And I have met everyone." "Yes," Jane said simply. "I mean it as a compliment," Felix said. "I know you do," Jane said. "I was agreeing with you." The centuries passed in a specific way, but centuries pass for beings who are not counting them, because counting them is not the relationship to time that immortality produces. They passed as the accumulation of the work and the conversations and the long evenings in the stone halls and the specific quality of existing alongside the same companions across a duration that no human framework for relationship was built to describe. The twins changed within that accumulation and remained, in their essentials, are exactly what they had always been. And at the center of everything, unchanged by the centuries in the way that the most fundamental things resist change, was the bond, still present, still the organizing fact of their existence, still located in the place below the reach of any external force, including time itself, that had always been where it lived. The world above Volterra changed enormously across those centuries. The human civilization shifted and transformed and rebuilt itself repeatedly around the ancient hill town where the Volturi sat in their permanent stillness. Languages changed, borders changed, the specific texture of human life changed beyond anything that would have been recognizable to the people who had inhabited the world of the twins' human childhood. The stone halls beneath the city remained the same. The twins within them remained, in every way that mattered, the same. And each other remained, as they had always remained, sufficient. Authority, in any world, is not simply the possession of power. It is the successful communication of power to everyone who might otherwise be tempted to test it. The distinction matters because power that is not communicated is power that must be demonstrated repeatedly in each new situation, against each new challenger, at the cost of the conflict each demonstration requires. Communicated power, power whose reputation has propagated so thoroughly through the relevant population that the demonstration is no longer necessary, operates at an entirely different level of efficiency, and it governs not through the repeated application of force, but through the continuous presence of the knowledge of what force is available. It governs in the most complete sense by making governance largely unnecessary. The Volturi had understood this for 3,000 years. Their authority over the vampire world was not maintained primarily through the frequency of their enforcement actions. The frequency was actually quite low, relative to the size of the population they governed and the duration across which they governed it. Most vampires, across most of their immortal lives, never had direct contact with the Volturi at all. They learned the law, they observed it, and they lived their long existences without ever requiring a visit from Volterra. This was not despite the Volturi's authority. It was the expression of it. The law held because the consequences of breaking it were known, and the consequences were known because the Volturi had been, across 3,000 years, completely consistent in applying them. Consistency was the mechanism, not harshness, though harshness was present when circumstances required it. Not frequency, though frequency was available when it was needed. Consistency. The absolute certainty, shared by every vampire who had ever considered the question, that the Volturi's response to violation of the law was not dependent on who was doing the violating, or how powerful they were, or how long they had existed, or how far from Volterra they happened to be. The law applied to everyone. The enforcement reached everywhere, and the outcome of being found in violation was the same, regardless of any factor that the violating party might have imagined would constitute a mitigating circumstance. This certainty was the Volturi's most important product, more important than any individual enforcement action, more valuable than any single capability possessed by any member of their guard, and the twins were the most essential instrument in his production, not because they were the strongest members of the guard in the purely physical sense. Felix was larger and physically more powerful than either of them, not because their gifts were the oldest or the most refined in a collection that had been assembled across 3 millennia. There were members of the guard with centuries more experience in the application of their specific capabilities. The twins' specific contribution to the Volturi's authority was something more structural than any of those individual comparisons captured. Their gifts together made resistance not merely dangerous, but effectively meaningless. And the meaninglessness of resistance was the specific quality that the Volturi's authority required to function at the level it functioned. You could imagine fighting Felix. You could assess your own physical capabilities against his and arrive at a calculation, however discouraging, that at least had the structure of a calculation. You could imagine planning against Dimitri's tracking, constructing scenarios in which you were difficult enough to locate that pursuit became impractical. These were losing calculations in almost every realistic scenario, but they were calculations. They had the form of something that a sufficiently determined or sufficiently desperate being might attempt. You could not meaningfully calculate against the twins. Alec's gift removed you from the equation before the equation had a chance to begin. Jane's gift addressed anything that remained after that removal. The sequence was complete, and the completion was the point. There was no defensive configuration that addressed both simultaneously because the two gifts operated on different enough principles that a defense against one was not a defense against the other, and the time available to deploy a defense against the first before the second became relevant was, in most practical situations, approximately none. The vampire world learned this the way it learned most things that it had no prior framework for. Through the accounts of those who had witnessed it directly, propagated across the community's communication networks, refined through retelling into a form that was both accurate in its essentials and vivid enough to carry the emotional weight of the original experience. Eliezer had been part of the Volturi Guard for several centuries before he left to form his small family in Alaska with Carmen, and his accounts of the twins were among the most authoritative in circulation because they came from someone who had worked alongside them rather than encountered them as a subject of enforcement. His gift for identifying and categorizing the abilities of other vampires gave his assessments a precision that eyewitness accounts from the other direction, from vampires who had been on the receiving end of Volturi enforcement, sometimes lacked, because the receiving end of Volturi enforcement was not a position from which precise assessment was easily made. He spoke about them to the Denali Coven on various occasions across the years, and what he said had the quality of genuine expert testimony rather than second-hand description. Jane's gift is not the most powerful thing I have encountered in terms of its raw effect, he told Tanya once. In the careful way he approached most assessments of supernatural capability. There are gifts that produce more dramatic, visible results. What makes hers different is the completeness of it. There is no partial application. There is no range at which the effect diminishes. There is no constitution strong enough to resist it. No mental discipline refined enough to manage it. Nothing that introduces any variable into the outcome other than whether she chooses to apply it or not. The only meaningful defense against it is to be outside its range before it is applied, and by the time most people understand that they should be moving, the moment for moving has passed. He paused. Alec is harder to describe to someone who has not experienced it. His gift does not feel like anything, which is precisely the problem. You do not experience it as an attack. You experience the before and then the after. And the after contains the knowledge of what happened between them without any memory of the happening itself. The psychological effect of that is something I watched in many targets across my years in the Guard, and it was consistently the most destabilizing experience any of them described. More destabilizing than Jane, in most cases. Pain is terrible, but pain is known. The void is not known, and the not knowing persists after recovery in ways that pain does not. This account, and the many others that circulated through the vampire world's informal communication across the centuries, built the twins' reputation into something that functioned as the Volturi had always intended their authority to function, at the level of preemptive deterrence. Covens that might otherwise have tested the boundaries of the law factored the twins into their calculation and arrived consistently at the conclusion that the boundaries were not worth testing. Individual vampires who experienced grievances against the Volturi's decisions, and there were always such grievances in any governed community across any duration, suppressed the impulse toward confrontation when the suppression of that impulse was the rational response to an accurate assessment of the likely outcome. The twins' names became, in the vocabulary of the vampire world, a specific kind of shorthand. To say that Aro was sending Jane was to communicate not simply that an enforcer was coming, but that the situation had been assessed as requiring the specific kind of resolution that admitted no ambiguity. It was the communication of finality, of a decision already made, of a situation that had passed from the territory of negotiation into the territory of execution, and the specific instrument of that execution was on its way. There were covens who disbanded preemptively upon receiving word that the twins had been dispatched, not because their violation was egregious enough to warrant destruction. Sometimes the situation was more nuanced than that, but because the calculation they performed upon receiving that specific information was a calculation that returned, consistently, a single rational response. They met the guard at a neutral location. They demonstrated their cooperation. They accepted the terms of whatever resolution Aro had determined was appropriate. And they did this because the alternative was a confrontation in which the twins' presence guaranteed an outcome that no calculation made the alternative appear worth the cost of producing. This was governance. This was the specific, efficient, as largely bloodless governance that the Volturi had been practicing for 3,000 years, and the twins were its most important instrument in its most refined form. Within the guard itself, their position was understood with the clarity that proximity to something extraordinary eventually produces. The other members of the guard were themselves extraordinary. Dimitri's tracking was without equal in the world. Felix's physical capabilities were among the most formidable in existence. The collective assembly of gifts within the Volturi's ranks represented the most concentrated gathering of supernatural ability in the vampire world. None of them were simple or unimpressive. The environment the twins inhabited was not one where they stood out by virtue of being in the company of ordinary things, and yet their standing within that environment was specific and recognized. Aro's favoritism was not hidden because it did not need to be hidden. In an institution governed by someone whose preferences were law by definition, concealing his preferences would have been both futile and pointless. The guard understood that Jane and Alec occupied a position in Aro's regard that the other members did not, and the guard's response to this was not primarily resentment. It was the pragmatic acknowledgement of people who understood capability and understood why capability of that specific kind warranted what it received. Felix expressed the general feeling on the subject with his characteristic directness one evening, in the context of a larger conversation about the guard's internal structure that had touched on the question of precedence. "No one disputes it," he said simply. "When you can do what they can do, the question of whether the arrangement is fair becomes somewhat academic." "You're very philosophical about it," Dimitri observed. "I am very practical about it," Felix said, which arrives at the same place. The twins were present for this exchange and said nothing, because saying something would have required engaging with a conversation about their own position that they found, as they found most conversations about themselves, less interesting than the people having the conversation imagined they would. Jane had heard the assessment of her capabilities many times in many forms across many centuries. It had ceased somewhere in the long accumulation of those hearings to produce any particular response in her. It was simply true. The truth did not require her ongoing acknowledgement to remain true. The mythology that built around them in the broader vampire world had a specific quality that distinguished it from the mythologies built around other powerful vampires. Most vampire legends, the ones that circulated through the community and acquired the specific resonance of things told and retold across generations, were organized around the exceptional nature of individual capability or individual history. The legend of a very old and very powerful vampire was a legend about that specific being's specific qualities, their age, their gifts, their particular history of extraordinary acts. The legend of the twins was organized around something different. It was organized around the pair, around the specific combination, around the fact that they were two, and that the two were, in combination, something that neither was individually. Their origin story was part of this. Two children burned for witchcraft, rescued by Aro, transformed into the most feared members of the most powerful institution in the vampire world. The arc of it carried a specific quality of irony and justice and warning that made it memorable in a way that simple accounts of capability did not. The village had tried to destroy them for being dangerous. The attempt had produced something so much more dangerous than what the village had feared, that the disproportion between the intended outcome and the actual one carried its own narrative weight. They were, in the mythology, a lesson. The lesson varied depending on who was telling it and what they wanted the audience to take away. For some, the lesson was about the Volturi, about the comprehensiveness of Aro's collection, about the depths of the resources he had assembled, about what it meant to cross an institution that counted the twins among its enforcers. For others, the lesson was about something more general and more old, about what happens when the world tries to extinguish something it should have learned to live alongside, about the specific and predictable way that destruction directed at the wrong thing tends to produce more of what it was trying to eliminate. The twins themselves had no particular relationship to the mythology, and they were aware of it in the way that people are aware of their own reputations, as a fact about the world that had practical implications and required occasional management, but did not constitute a significant part of their interior lives. Jane found it mildly useful in certain enforcement contexts, where the reputation preceded the visit in ways that simplified the eventual resolution. Alec found it accurate in its essentials and uninteresting in its details, which was his relationship to most things that did not present him with new information. What mattered to them was not the legend. It had never been the legend. What mattered was the work and the institution and the specific arrangement of their existence within it that had been the shape of their lives for several hundred years. And what mattered beneath all of that, as it had always mattered beneath all of that, was each other. The bond that the village had failed to burn away, the fact that had survived everything the world had directed at it and arrived in the present moment of the saga's timeline intact, as complete and as foundational as it had been on the morning they walked out of the English forest into whatever came next. The world had learned their names. It had learned what those names meant and what the presence of those names in a situation implied for everyone else in that situation. It had organized a significant portion of its collective behavior around the knowledge of what the twins were capable of and what they were willing to do. None of this had changed what they were to each other. Nothing had. Nothing was going to. Volterra in the middle of the day in late March carries a specific quality of light that the Tuscan region produces in that particular season. Bright and angled and carrying more warmth than the temperature justifies, the kind of light that makes ancient stone look like something painted rather than built, that turns the piazzas and the narrow streets of a hill town into something that belongs more to the vocabulary of art than of ordinary geography. The city above the Volturi's halls was, on the day that Edward Cullen arrived intending to die, full of tourists celebrating the St. Marcus Day festival, the streets crowded with red cloaks, and the specific festive noise of a human community engaged in the annual ritual of its own continuity. Below the city, in the permanent candlelit quiet of the ancient halls, and the twins were aware of the day's business well before the principals of it arrived. They heard about Edward through Aro, who had received word through the Volturi's network of contacts that one of the Cullen family's members was in the region and had made a request. An extraordinary request. The kind that the Volturi received rarely enough that it registered as an event of genuine interest rather than routine administration. He wanted to be destroyed. He had a reason that Aro had assessed from the account he received, with the specific quality of attention he brought to situations that contained more than their surface presented. The reason involved a human girl. The reason involved the belief, apparently, that the human girl was dead, and Jane received this information with the expression she maintained for information that was interesting without yet being actionable. A quality of attention that was neither dismissive nor engaged, simply present, collecting what was available and filing it in the appropriate location. "He's coming here," she said to Alec, not as a question. "He's already in the city," Alec said. He'd been monitoring the situation with the focused attention he brought to anything that arrived in their world from the direction of the Cullen family, whom the Volturi had been watching with the specific interest reserved for covens that represented potential complications. The Cullen family was one of those complications in the technical sense. Large, well-established, possessed of several gifted members, acting and organized around a set of principles that made them simultaneously more trustworthy and more unpredictable than the average coven. Carlyle's relationship with Ara was old and carried the specific texture of genuine mutual regard between two beings who understood each other's positions clearly enough to maintain respect across their considerable differences. But the Cullens' presence in the world was a variable, and Aro did not prefer variables. He preferred known quantities. His interest in acquiring Edward specifically, in bringing the telepath's extraordinary gift into the Guard, had been noted and expressed on previous occasions. Today's situation was an unexpected variation on that interest. The throne room was arranged as it always was. Aro and his brothers in their chairs at the room's far end, and the Guard distributed through the space with the practiced positioning of people who understand that a room's architecture is also a tactical resource. Felix was stationed near the main entrance. Dimitri was present in his characteristic position of maximum observational range. Jane stood near Aro's right, which was her standard position in formal settings, close enough to respond without hesitation, visible enough to function as the specific kind of reminder that her presence in a room always constituted. Alec was positioned several feet to Jane's left, his stillness the particular quality of stillness that was his own, the kind that felt not like the absence of movement, but like the presence of something that had decided not to move, which was a different thing entirely. They heard the doors before they opened, and Edward came in with two human women. The girl Bella, whose name had circulated through the Volturi's intelligence as the human Edward Cullen had complicated everything with, and her companion Alice, whose precognitive gift was one of the items on Aro's long list of capabilities he would have liked to add to the Guard. The three of them entered the throne room with the specific quality of people who have arrived at a destination that none of them expected to reach through the sequence of events that had brought them here, carrying the particular tension of a situation that was still, in its outcome, entirely undetermined. Edward's appearance communicated a great deal before he said anything. He was intact, which meant his attempt to provoke the Guard in the square above had not proceeded far enough to produce the damage he had apparently intended it to produce. He was controlled, which was a quality the twins noted because controlled was not the state of a vampire in genuine despair, and genuine despair was what the situation was supposed to contain. He was looking at the human girl with an expression that resolved, for anyone watching with sufficient attention, the question of why any of this had happened at all. The girl was alive. That much was visible. She was standing on her own and breathing in the specific pattern of someone managing genuine fear with a composure that was more than most humans brought to the Volturi's throne room. Kashi was looking around the room with the particular quality of attention of someone who is trying to understand their environment faster than their environment is presenting itself for understanding. Jane watched her with the assessing attention she brought to anything that arrived in her space as a potential unknown quantity. The girl was human. She was young, brown-haired, unremarkable by the visual standards that mattered in the ordinary human world. She was the reason that one of the most gifted vampires in the contemporary world had traveled to Volterra to request his own destruction, which was itself a form of information about her significance that the ordinary visual assessment did not capture. Aro conducted the initial conversation with the smooth, a warm authority he brought to all formal interactions. The specific quality of a host who is also, in every meaningful sense, the only person in the room whose preferences determined outcomes. He engaged Edward with the genuine interest of someone who found the situation, in its particulars, compelling. He expressed his regret that the circumstances had resolved themselves before his guard had an opportunity to assist. He expressed his continued interest in the question of Edward's future, and in the future of his extraordinary gift, in the specific terms that made the interest clear without making the intention explicit. Then Aro turned his attention to the girl, and the room's quality changed in the specific way that rooms change when Aro's attention finds something he did not expect. He extended his hand to her. Edward's reaction to this, a slight tightening of his already controlled posture, a fractional shift in the careful management of his expression, was the first visible indication that what was about to happen was not going to proceed in the way Aro expected it to. Jane registered this without moving, with the interior attention that was her primary mode of processing important information. Aro took Bella's hand. He closed his eyes with the practiced ease of someone performing an action so thoroughly habitual that it required no deliberate preparation. He held her hand for a long moment in the silence of a room that understood what was happening and was waiting to see what it produced. His expression, when it changed in a way that the room had not seen before. Not dramatically, and Aro's control was 3,000 years in the making and did not fail in visible ways. But the quality of his stillness shifted, and the specific shift communicated something to everyone in the room who was calibrated to read him. He had encountered something his gift could not fully access. He had pressed against a barrier and found it solid in a way he could not immediately explain or categorize. He released her hand and looked at her. "Fascinating," he said softly, and the word carried 3,000 years of accumulated experience behind it, pressed into a single observation that contained more information than its syllables suggested. His red eyes moved over Bella with an expression that Edward, across the room, was reading in real time and finding profoundly concerning, and the expression of a collector encountering something he did not yet understand but fully intended to. "Jane," had been watching this. She had read Aro's reaction with the precision she brought to reading anything that involved the deployment or the failure of supernatural capability, because supernatural capability and its limits were her area of most concentrated expertise. She understood what his expression meant. She understood that the girl had produced in Aro the specific response of genuine opacity, and the significance of that, the significance of anything producing genuine opacity in Aro, was not lost on her. She filed this in the same location she filed everything important, present, catalogue, available. What followed was Aro's navigation of the situation toward its resolution, which required managing both the immediate question of what to do with 3 visitors who had seen too much, and the longer-term question of what those visitors represented as a political and strategic consideration. The decision arrived at was the one that served the institution's interests in the most direct way. The human girl would be transformed. This was the condition under which the situation resolved, without requiring outcomes that Aro, for reasons that included the genuine regard he held for Carlyle, would have preferred to avoid. Caius was dissatisfied with this resolution. He expressed his dissatisfaction with the specific quality of impatience that characterized his engagement with most situations that did not resolve in the most direct possible way. He looked at Bella with a cold assessment of someone who found the exception being made on her behalf insufficiently justified by the circumstances. The law exists for a reason, he said, to the room rather than to any particular person in it. The law exists to serve a purpose, Aro replied pleasantly, and the purpose is best served here by the arrangement I have described. Caius was quiet, which was not agreement, but was, in the structure of the Volturi's leadership, functionally equivalent to it. Jane had been waiting through this exchange for the moment that her position in the situation required her to address. The agreement had been reached. The terms had been stated. The visitors were being permitted to leave, but the girl was human, and the girl had seen the throne room and its occupants and the specific quality of what happened in it, and the institutional position on humans who had seen too much was clear, regardless of the agreement that had just been reached regarding her future. She turned her attention to Edward. The gift deployed with the focused precision she brought to all its applications. Edward dropped to his knees with the totality that Jane's gift always produced. The complete and instantaneous transition from functional to incapacitated, that no amount of preparation or experience significantly mitigated. Bella's response to watching Edward go to his knees was immediate and physical. She moved toward him, the instinctive motion of someone responding to the suffering of someone they loved before their conscious mind had time to intervene in the response. Jane watched this with the specific attention of someone collecting information about the nature of the relationship she was observing, which was more information than the visual assessment alone had provided. Then she looked at Bella directly. She turned the gift toward the girl with the same focused precision, the same complete and practiced application of the capability that had never, in all its centuries of use, produced anything other than the result she intended. Nothing. Jane processed this result in the fraction of a second that processing required, which was faster than any visible response, and faster than anyone watching her closely could have caught, unless they were specifically looking for the moment of recalculation. She applied the gift again, with the full concentration of her attention. directed at this specific human girl standing 3 feet away in the throne room of the Volturi. Nothing. The serenity of her expression developed the specific quality it developed when something required management that it was not, in the immediate moment, receiving. Something moved beneath the surface of her composure, cold and precise and entirely contained, the interior response of someone whose most fundamental certainty had just been contradicted by direct evidence. She looked at the girl for a moment longer with the eyes of someone who is genuinely, for the first time in a very long time, encountering something they do not have a category for. The girl looked back at her with an expression that contained no awareness of what had just occurred, no sense that she had been the subject of anything, and no recognition that the focused attention of the most feared gift in the vampire world had been directed at her twice and had produced nothing either time. Jane said nothing. There was nothing to say that the situation permitted her to say. The room contained Aro, who had his own relationship to the girl's particular opacity, and Edward, who was reading Jane's thoughts with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what he was witnessing, and Alice, whose precognitive awareness of the room's dynamics was its own form of surveillance. There was no statement Jane could make about what had just occurred that would not hand information to the wrong people, or invite a conversation that the current moment was not the right moment to have. She released Edward from the gift with the same deliberate control with which she had deployed it. The release was not a concession. It was a decision made on her own terms, in her own time. Aro concluded the proceedings with the smooth efficiency of someone who had observed everything that had occurred in his throne room, had processed it with the comprehensive intelligence of 3,000 years of experience, and had filed it in the location where it belonged, in the category of things that were not yet resolved, not yet fully understood, not yet available for the kind of action that understanding makes possible. "We will meet again," he said to Edward, as the three of them prepared to leave, and the warmth of his tone did not obscure the specific quality of certainty that the statement carried. It was not a pleasantry, it was an assessment. The doors of the throne room closed behind them. Jane stood in the return quiet of the room and said nothing, because nothing required saying. She looked at the doors for a moment with the expression she used when she was processing something she intended to return to at a more appropriate time. Alec was beside her, as he always was. He had watched the entire sequence with the quiet totality of his attention, had seen Jane's gift fail twice against the same girl, had watched Aro's hand on the girl's produce the response of genuine obstruction. He had his own filing to do, his own implications to trace through their logical directions. He did not speak immediately. Neither did she. After a moment, without turning to look at her, he said quietly, "She was not afraid of you." Jane considered this. "No," she said. "Why, she was not." The observation was precise and significant, and neither of them elaborated on it, because elaboration was not required between them. The girl had stood in the Volturi's throne room, in the direct line of Jane's gift, applied twice in succession, and had registered nothing. Not relief at a defense she knew she possessed, not fear of what she could see being done to Edward, nothing that indicated awareness of being under any kind of supernatural assault. She had simply been present, sealed in the specific way of someone who carried a protection they did not know they were carrying. both of them knew what that meant. It meant the protection was structural, built in, not a choice or a skill or a consciously maintained defense. It meant the girl was something that neither of them had encountered before in all their centuries of existence. Something that the categories available to the Volturi's most experienced members did not yet fully contain. They stood in the throne room of the Volturi, in the candlelit quiet, in the ancient halls beneath the ancient hill town, and the certainty they had both built their existences around had acquired, in the space of one afternoon, an exception. One exception. For now. The battlefield in the clearing north of Forks, in the early hours of a June morning, was not a place the Volturi arrived at as participants. They arrived as observers, and the distinction was deliberate, because observations served the Volturi's purposes in that specific situation more completely than participation would have. And a war between the Cullen family and a newborn army was a situation that produced useful outcomes regardless of which side prevailed. Either the Cullens were weakened or eliminated, which addressed one of the variables in the Volturi's long-term calculation, or the newborn army was destroyed, which was the appropriate outcome for an unauthorized creation of that scale and represented a violation of the law that required formal acknowledgement. They arrived when the fighting was already finished. This too was deliberate. Jane led the contingent, as she usually led the contingent in situations that were expected to require her specific capabilities. Felix was present, and Dimitri, and several other members of the guard, and Alec was not with this particular group. His deployment was reserved for situations that required the more comprehensive neutralization his gift provided, and the battlefield in the clearing, with its single surviving newborn and its question of formal disposition, did not rise to that threshold. Jane's gift was sufficient for what remained to be done. The clearing was quiet when they arrived, the way clearings are quiet in the aftermath of violence. The specific stillness of a space that has been the site of something extreme and has not yet fully returned to its ordinary state. The air carrying the residue of what had passed through it. The Cullen family was present, and their wolf allies, and the broken remnants of the newborn army were scattered across the ground in the specific condition that characterized the aftermath of a vampire conflict. A single newborn remained intact, a young female, small, crouched in the posture of someone who had made the assessment of their situation and understood it completely. This was Britannia. Jane looked at her with the assessing attention she brought to any subject she was required to evaluate. The girl was young in the way of newborns, perhaps a few months transformed, carrying the specific combination of extraordinary physical capability and almost total inability to manage the implications of possessing it that define the newborn state. She was frightened, which was the appropriate response to the situation she was in, and she was attempting to control the fear with a degree of success that was, for a newborn, modestly impressive. The Cullens had taken her prisoner rather than destroying her. Carlyle spoke on her behalf with the measured quality he brought to situations that required the navigation of competing legitimate interests. The law's requirements on one side, the specific circumstances of an individual who had not chosen her situation on the other. He presented the case for mercy with the careful precision of someone who understood that mercy was not a concept the Volturi processed in the way he processed it, but who made the argument anyway, because not making it was not available to him. Jane listened to this. She listened with the expression she wore when she was collecting information rather than preparing a response, and taking in what Carlyle said and filing it against what she already knew about his character and his consistent approach to questions of this kind. Then she looked at Bree. "She has seen too much," Jane said simply. The statement was not cruel in its delivery. It was the delivery of a conclusion that the facts of the situation produced without requiring additional reasoning, stated in the tone of someone for whom the conclusion and the statement of the conclusion were the same gesture. Carlyle's expression acknowledged the accuracy of the assessment without conceding the inevitability of the outcome it pointed toward. He was not arguing that Bree had not seen too much. He was arguing that what she had seen did not require the response the law specified, that circumstances existed in which the law's spirit and the law's letter diverged, and that this was one of those circumstances. Jane processed this argument with the fairness she brought to arguments she had already decided against. She understood Carlyle's position. She understood the specific quality of his commitment to it, which was genuine and consistent, and not something she dismissed as sentimental even when she did not share it. But the law was the law because it was the law, because its force derived from its consistency. And consistency meant it applied in cases where its application was uncomfortable, as well as in cases where it was not. She looked at Bree for a moment longer with the focused attention that preceded the deployment of her gift. The application was immediate and complete and lasted exactly as long as was required to serve its purpose. Bree's experience of the final moments of her very short immortal life was not one that Jane gave extended consideration to, because extended consideration of that kind was not consistent with performing the function she was here to perform. The function was the function. It served the institution, it served the law, and it served the specific and essential quality of certainty that the Volturi's authority rested upon. She turned her attention to the Cullen family and their assembled allies. The assessment she communicated in that turn of her attention, the inventory of their numbers, their condition, the composition of their capabilities, was delivered back to Aro through the channels available to her, which included her own observations and what she could determine from the surface of the thoughts of those present who were not shielded from Edward's telepathy, and therefore not from her own ability to read what Edward was reading. The Cullens were stronger than the last formal accounting had suggested. Their wolf alliance was more developed, more integrated into the family's operational structure than had been understood from the Volturi's previous intelligence. The confrontation with the newborn army had been resolved with a completeness and a speed that indicated a collective capability that exceeded what the individual members' known gifts would have predicted. This was information. She filed it and took it back to Volterra, and where it entered the ongoing calculation that Aro maintained about the Cullen family's position in the larger landscape of the vampire world. The calculation was already running before she returned with her report. It had been running for some time, and its outputs across the months that followed the eclipse battlefield were moving in a direction that eventually produced the decision to send the full force of the Volturi to Forks. The cause was the child. The news of Renesmee's existence reached Volterra through Irina of the Denali Coven, who had been present near the Cullen territory and had seen something she believed she understood, and did not. She reported an immortal child, a creation explicitly and absolutely prohibited by the Volturi's law, as prohibited with a completeness and a consistency that exceeded even the law of secrecy in its lack of exception, because the history of what immortal children had done to the vampire world was a history the oldest vampire still carried in the specific, immediate way of memory rather than record. Aro received this report and made his decision, and the twins were present when he made it. The decision was framed, as the Volturi's decisions were always framed, in the language of law and obligation. The law had been violated. The evidence had been presented by a witness in good standing. The Volturi's obligation was clear. Aro discussed it with his brothers with the quality of careful deliberation that preceded all formally significant decisions, and the discussion arrived at the conclusion that the situation required the full force of the guard. Jane listened to the deliberation with the attention she always brought to Aro's decision-making, the specific quality of attention that was interested in the reasoning as much as the conclusion. She had her own assessment of what the situation actually was. She had seen the Cullen family in the clearing, had seen the composition and the capability of what they had assembled, had understood that the Eclipse battlefield represented only a fraction of what a fully mobilized confrontation with the Cullens and their network might involve. The full force of the Guard was the appropriate response, not because the law required it specifically, but because the situation's actual dimensions demanded it. She agreed with the decision, and this was not always the case, though she expressed disagreement rarely and through channels that were not public. In this case, the agreement was genuine. The journey to Forks was the Volturi at its most formally assembled, the full guard, the three leaders, a complement of witnesses whose role was to observe and report, the complete institutional expression of 3,000 years of accumulated authority moving in a single coordinated direction. They moved through the landscape of the Pacific Northwest, in the specific formation that centuries of enforcement had refined into something that was simultaneously tactical and ceremonial. The guard in position around the leadership, the twins at their standard stations near Aro, the whole assembly communicating through its configuration the specific message that configuration was designed to communicate. They were not hurrying. Beings who were certain of their outcomes did not hurry. The clearing was cold, December cold, the specific cold of the Pacific Northwest in the deep of winter, the air carrying the dense moisture of the region's perpetual proximity to rain. The assembled group waiting for them was larger than any enforcement action Aro had faced in living memory. The Cullen family, their wolf allies, and a gathering of witnesses from vampire communities across the world, assembled with the organizational sophistication of something that had been planned with considerable care across a significant period of time. Jane read the assembled group with the tactical attention of someone whose function required accurate assessment of what was actually present. She noted the gifts, those she could identify from the Volturi's intelligence, and those she could not identify, which were themselves a category of information. She noted the wolves, whose presence added a variable that the standard Volturi enforcement playbook did not have a fully refined response to. She noted the quality of stillness that the assembled witnesses maintained, which was the stillness of people who had committed to a position. and were prepared to hold it. Not the fearful compliance that the Volturi's presence usually produced. This was not the standard configuration of a confrontation. This was something different in kind. Aro moved to the front of the formation with the unhurried authority of someone who had navigated every kind of confrontation the vampire world had produced across 3,000 years and found each one ultimately manageable. He began the formal exchange with the Cullen family, the articulation of the law's requirements, the presentation of Irina's testimony, the specific institutional language of an authority that was explaining its own obligations rather than making choices. Behind him, Alec received the moment that required his gift with the quiet recognition of someone who'd been preparing for it since the formation left Volterra. He released the shimmer. It moved across the clearing with the unhurried certainty that had always characterized its movement, the visible distortion in the cold air that was the only external indication of what the gift was doing, rolling outward from Alec toward the assembled group with the patient thoroughness of something that had never failed to arrive at its destination. It reached the edges of the gathered witnesses first, and the effect began there with the gradual, methodical progression that was the gift's defining quality. Then it reached the center of the clearing, and the girl who was standing there, and it stopped. The stop was not gradual. It was not a slowing or a diminishing or a progressive loss of effect at increasing distance from Alec. It was a stop, complete, immediate, absolute, as though the shimmer had encountered a surface, and the surface had declined to admit it. The gift curled against the edge of her presence with the specific quality of something meeting a boundary. It had no instruction for encountering, and went no further. Alec processed this result with the precision that his centuries of practiced self-containment made available to him. He adjusted the angle of the projection. He increased the intensity. He held the gift at full deployment and directed it with the complete concentration of his focused attention toward the space she occupied, and the space she occupied returned his gift to him with the thoroughness of something that was not defending itself, because it did not need to defend itself. The protection was not active. It was simply present, and in the way that walls are present, not choosing to stop what came against them, but stopping it regardless. He looked at Jane. Jane was already looking at what was happening, had already understood what she was seeing, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone encountering a second confirmation of a fact that the first confirmation had established, but that the second, in a different context and at a different scale, was making more fully real. The throne room had been one setting. This was another. The girl's protection was not situational. It was not the product of a specific alignment of circumstances that the throne room had provided and other settings would not. It was structural, and it was complete, and it was present here, in a December clearing in Washington, exactly as it had been present in Volterra in March. And then the girl extended the shield. This was the part that neither of them had anticipated, and it required a moment of recalibration that neither of them made visible. She stretched the protection she carried outward from herself, over the people nearest her, extending its perimeter with the focused effort of someone using a capability they were still learning to control, but controlling nonetheless. Alec's shimmer stopped at the shield's edge, wherever the shield extended to, denied access not only to the girl herself, but to every person she chose to bring within her protection. She was covering the assembled witnesses. She was neutralizing Alec's gift not simply for herself, but for the entire group she was defending, holding the Volturi's most comprehensive tactical weapon at bay with a capability that had been active for a matter of months, deployed with a precision that most vampires spend decades developing. Alec stood in the cold and watched this with the specific quality of stillness he maintained when he was processing something that exceeded his existing frameworks. His gift was perfect. It had always been perfect. It continued to be exactly what it was, operating exactly as it always operated. The problem was not the gift. The problem was the surface it was meeting. Jane turned her attention to Edward, and the gift deployed with a focused immediacy that bypassed deliberation, because deliberation was not required. She had been directing her gift at targets for centuries, and the motion of it was as automatic as any action performed 10,000 times becomes. Edward went to his knees with the totality she expected, which confirmed that the gift was functioning, that the issue was not her capability, but the specific nature of what the girl carried. She turned to the girl. The gift directed at Bella Swan produced, for the third time across 3 encounters in 2 years, precisely nothing. Jane held the focus for longer than was tactically necessary, because the situation was one that warranted certainty, and certainty required confirmation, and confirmation required the elimination of every possible variable that might have explained the result through any mechanism other than the one the evidence consistently indicated. She applied the gift with the full precision of her complete attention. She maintained the application through the several seconds it would take to affect any target she had ever directed it toward. Nothing. Complete. Absolute. Structural nothing. She released the focus with the deliberate control of someone making a decision rather than accepting an outcome. Her expression maintained the serenity that was its permanent public quality. Nothing in her visible presentation communicated to the assembled clearing what she was experiencing internally, which was the specific and unfamiliar sensation of someone whose most fundamental certainty was being tested in front of every significant witness the vampire world had produced. The confrontation continued to develop around her through the forms that Aro's management of the situation was guiding it toward. Alice arrived, which changed the dynamics of the gathering in ways that Jane observed and assessed, with the portion of her attention not occupied by the ongoing tactical recalculation that the shield's full demonstration had made necessary. Nahuel's presence dissolved the legal justification that had organized the entire enterprise. Aro conducted the internal deliberation that the new information required, and the deliberation arrived at the conclusion that the situation did not, on the evidence currently available, warrant the action the Volturi had traveled to Forks to perform. The retreat was managed with the dignity that 3,000 years of institutional authority made available even in withdrawal, organized, measured, communicating through its own quality that this was a decision rather than a defeat. The Volturi did not retreat in the way of entities that had been overcome. They withdrew in the way of entities that had reassessed and determined that their interests were best served by a different course than the one they had arrived to execute. Jane walked back through the cold forest with the guard, in the formation they maintained on the return, as they had maintained it on the approach. Alec was beside her. They did not speak for a long time, because the walk through the forest provided the specific quality of quiet that the clearing had not, and some things were better processed in quiet. Eventually, Alec said, "She covered all of them." "Yes," Jane said. "She's been transformed for less than a year." "Yes," Jane said again. A pause, in which the forest moved around them and the cold pressed against their skin, with the indifference of weather toward beings it could not affect. "What she is," Alec said carefully, "is not something the existing accounting contains." Jane walked for several steps before responding. "No," she said, "it is not." This was as far as either of them would take the conversation in the forest, in the returning formation of the guard, in the company of ears that were calibrated to receive every frequency of sound the air carried. The full implications of what they had observed across the two encounters with Bella Swan. The throne room, the clearing, the consistent and absolute failure of both their gifts against the same target across 2 years and 2 completely different contexts, were implications that required a different setting and a different kind of consideration than the march back through a December forest provided. What was not in question was the fact itself. Their gifts had met an absolute exception. Not a difficult case, not a near miss, not a target that had required more effort than usual. An exception. A complete and permanent and structural exception, built into the fabric of a being whose nature the Volturi's 3,000 years of accumulated intelligence had not fully anticipated and could not yet fully explain. The Volturi did not encounter things they could not explain. This was part of the foundational certainty of their identity. The institution that had governed the hidden world for 3 millennia was the institution that understood the hidden world completely, that had no genuine surprises left, that had accumulated across its long history a comprehensive enough picture of what was possible, that new things did not genuinely surprise it, but only confirmed what it had always known. The girl in the clearing had been a genuine surprise. They walked through the forest and said nothing further, and the snow that had begun to fall settled on the trees around them with the quiet indifference of the natural world to the things that moved through it. Behind them, the clearing returned to its ordinary state, at the extraordinary gathering that had occupied it for the previous hours dispersing back into the world that had produced it. The twins carried what they had seen back with them to Volterra, back to the stone halls and the candlelight, and the ancient institution that they had served for several centuries, and would serve for as many centuries more as the world and Aro and the specific arrangement of their immortal lives required. They carried it in the way they carried everything, together in the particular interior space the bond provided, where most things eventually found their resolution or their resting place. The exception travelled with them. It did not resolve. It simply remained, filed carefully in the place where important unresolved things were kept, and waiting for the moment when the world would present the circumstances that made its full meaning finally clear. There is a question that the story of the twins keeps returning to, in the specific way that important questions return. Not loudly, not with the insistence of something demanding immediate resolution, but quietly, persistently, in the margins of every chapter and every century, and every deployment of gifts that should not exist in beings who began their lives as human children in a medieval English village. The question is not what they became. What they became is documented. It is known, feared, and as thoroughly established as anything in the vampire world's long record of extraordinary things. The question is what the becoming cost, and what, if anything, was preserved through the cost of it. The through line of their story, held in full view from the village in Huntingdon to the December clearing in Forks, is one of the most specific and most unsparing arcs in the entire Twilight universe. They were children who were different in ways their world could not accommodate. Their world's response to that difference was to attempt to unmake them entirely, to use the most complete form of destruction available to it against two children whose only offense was being genuinely, structurally, irrevocably other than what the world expected them to be. The attempt failed. It failed in the specific and ironic way that attempts to destroy the wrong thing tend to fail, by producing more of what it was trying to eliminate, concentrated and amplified and freed from every limiting factor that the human context had placed upon it. The fire did not destroy them. The fire made them. This is the central fact of their story, and it carries a weight that the saga's framing as a romance sometimes obscures, but never entirely eliminates. Transformation in Maya's universe is always the amplification of what was already present, the deepest truth of the human self concentrated into something that exceeds natural limits. For most vampires, this means a gift emerges, a capability develops that was hinted at in the human life, and becomes something extraordinary in the immortal one. For the twins, the amplification was of something that the human world had already identified as monstrous and had already tried to eliminate on those grounds. What the village feared in them was real. The gifts were real in their human form, and operating below the threshold of the supernatural, but present and functional and genuinely other than ordinary human capability. The village's assessment that they were dangerous was not wrong. Its response to that accurate assessment was to attempt destruction rather than accommodation, which was the specific failure that transformed what it feared into something so much larger than what it had been afraid of, that the disproportion carried its own dark eloquence. They emerged from the fire as exactly what the fire had tried to prevent, and they have been that, without apology and without significant revision, for every century since. The question of their inner lives, what Jane and Alec experience as emotional beings across the long centuries of their immortal existence, and what the interior of their lives actually contains beneath the institutional function and the fearsome reputation, is one the saga does not answer directly, because the saga observes them primarily from the outside, through the perspectives of characters who encounter them as subjects of fear rather than as people to be understood. But the question is worth sitting with, because the outside view, however accurate in its observations, inevitably misses what the inside view would provide. Jane feels. This is established not through anything she says about herself, but through the specific quality of what moves beneath her serenity when the serenity is disrupted. The cold precision that appears at its edges when her gift fails. The fierce protectiveness that organizes itself around Alec in every situation where Alec's position or safety is relevant. The specific quality of her loyalty to Aro, which is not the flat, effectless loyalty of someone performing an obligation, but the complex loyalty of someone who has genuinely decided, across centuries of the evidence available to them, that this is where they belong and this is who they serve, and that decision is real and continuously reaffirmed rather than simply maintained through inertia. She feels with the same intensity that she has always felt, which is the intensity of someone for whom the interior life is not a quiet country, but a landscape of significant weather, managed into its current controlled form through centuries of deliberate practice. The serenity is real, and it is also the most impressive ongoing act of self-governance in a saga full of beings engaged in self-governance as a survival strategy. Alec's inner life is quieter in its expression and not quieter in its substance. He carries things in the interior catalogue that he maintains. In the same place he has always carried things that required careful holding. The knowledge of what his gift does in its full application, the specific weight of the centuries of enforcement work, the long, patient accumulation of observations about the world and the institution, and the specific people within it that has built, across the long time available to him, into something that resembles understanding in its most complete form. He is not detached. He is the specific kind of person who appears detached because the depth of their engagement is not visible on the surface, and whose apparent stillness is the stillness of something very active in the interior, beneath the level that outside observation can easily reach. The bond between them is the thing that the full account of their story insists upon as its most significant and most enduring fact. Everything else about their immortal lives, the gifts, the centuries, the institution, the reputation, exists around this central fact without displacing it. They have been each other's fixed point through everything that the world and the fire and the centuries have directed at them. The bond survived the burning. It survived the transformation. And it survived several hundred years of existing within an institution that valued them primarily as instruments, that loved them in the specific complicated way that Aro loved the most prized elements of his collection, that provided them with purpose and safety and belonging without providing them with the one thing the bond between them had always provided, which was the experience of being fully known by someone for whom the knowing was not mediated by use. They knew each other without use. They always had. And in a world organized around capability and function and the specific political currencies of the vampire community, that kind of knowing was not common enough to be taken for granted by anyone who possessed it. The tragedy of the twins, and if tragedy is the right frame for lives that have produced the specific outcomes their lives have produced, is not the burning. The burning was done to them by others and they did not choose it. The tragedy, if it exists, is in the specific narrowing that the burning and the transformation and the centuries of the Volturi's work together produced. The gradual reduction of their world to the dimensions of the institution. The foreclosing of the broader possibilities that immortal existence theoretically contains, the way that beings who might have been extraordinary in many directions became extraordinary in a very specific direction and no others. They are the most feared names in the vampire world. They have served the most powerful institution in that world with a completeness and a consistency that centuries of work have refined into something close to perfect. They have each other, which is the one thing in their world that exists entirely outside the dimensions of the institution and entirely outside the reach of anything the world has yet directed at it. Whether this constitutes a good immortal life is a question the saga does not attempt to answer, and perhaps it should not. The standards available for assessing a good immortal life are not standards that human frameworks are built to apply. What can be said is that their lives contain, at their center, a connection of genuine and extraordinary depth, and that the specific form of their capabilities and their history has given them a purpose they have inhabited with complete commitment. That these things coexist with the specific costs the story has documented does not resolve the question of whether the coexistence is enough. It simply describes what the coexistence actually contains. The children in Huntingdon are still present in the twins. Not visibly, not in any way that the vampire world's observation of them would easily locate, but present in the specific way that origins are always present in the people they produced, in the particular intensity that Jane has always brought to the deployment of her gift, which carries in it the ghost of the human girl who learned very early that her specific kind of power was the only reliable resource she possessed, in the specific quality of Alec's patient observation, which carries in it the ghost of the boy who learned very early that the world was a thing to be understood carefully before it was engaged with directly. The fire burned the children and made the instruments, but the instruments were made from the children, and the children are therefore still, in every way that origin is permanent, present. They are Jane and Alec, the most feared members of the Volturi Guard, the twins that the vampire world learned to dread across several centuries of carefully accumulated evidence, the children that a medieval English village tried to burn and instead, in the specific failure of that attempt, made into something the world had no prior category for. They are still, after everything, each other's. This is the oldest fact about them and the most enduring one. And it is the fact that the fire, for all its completeness, never touched. Whatever the world makes of them next, whatever the ongoing story of the Volturi and the Cullen family and the larger history of the hidden world produces in the chapters that have not yet been written, this fact will be present in it, unchanged because it was always the thing that was not available for changing, located in the place below the reach of any external force that the world has yet produced. The fire made them, and what the fire made, they have remained. So here we are, at the quiet end of a long and patient night. We began with two children in the dark of medieval England, in a world that found them wrong in ways it could not name, and responded to that wrongness with fire. We followed them through the burning and the transformation and the centuries of stone halls and candlelight, and work performed in the service of the oldest authority in the vampire world. We sat with their gifts and their centuries, and the specific, unbreakable fact of each other that survived everything the world directed at them. And what we found, beneath all of it, was not a story about monsters. It was a story about what happens when the world tries to destroy something it does not understand and fails, and what walks out of that failure still carrying, against all reasonable expectation, the one thing it was never willing to surrender. They are still there, in the stone beneath Volterra, in the permanent candlelit quiet, together as they have always been. Let that quietness carry you now. The fire is long finished. The night is still. Good night.